a generous soul.
She was a very giving person and a very sharing person.
Who helped neighbors in need.
When they needed extra money for baby food or diapers, Janora was always there.
Is found brutally murdered.
This homicide was one of the most violent homicides that I've worked.
There was blood from basically the floor to the ceiling.
It was something that shocked the community.
Police uncover a sinister trail of deception and hate.
He had some strange tendencies. He seemed to be stalking her.
The polygraph came back with some clear signs that he was being deceptive.
To unveil a killer no one expected.
He made her believe that he was her knight in shining armor, so she never saw it coming.
He had two completely different faces on him. He was just the devil incarnate.
One hot summer morning in the sleepy rural town of Clinton, Louisiana, the sheriff's office gets a call that sends them to a farmhouse just outside of town. It belongs to a woman named Janora Guillory.
When Janora didn't show up for work on Monday morning, her coworkers started to get nervous. They called her cell phone, she didn't answer. They called her landline, and it was busy, it stayed busy. At that point, a friend at work called the sheriff's office in East Feliciana and said, "Would you please go check on our coworker, Janora Guillory?"
The deputy that worked for the East Feliciana Sheriff's Office, and he went to the residence to look for her. The door was unlocked. And he discovered the body.
He backed out of the house, and he said he threw up outside. He could barely even speak to the dispatcher. He was so upset by what he found.
Detectives are called to the scene.
You could tell something had happened at the very entrance of the door. There was blood right there on the door handle.
The blood on the floor leads detectives inside the house.
There, you could follow the blood trail, and it went into the kitchen. There were several knives that had blood on them inside of the drawer. There was also evidence like someone tried to use the phone, and there was blood on the side of the phone.
The blood leads to the bedroom, where detectives are met with a gruesome sight. In the middle of the floor lies the lifeless body of 42-year-old Janora Guillory.
You could see evident tears in her skin, which, I mean, we knew at the time were deep stab wounds. She was beaten severely. There was blood from basically the floor to the ceiling.
The lamp was broken and stuff knocked over in the bedroom.
I've seen other homicides that I've worked that this one was more brutal.
The body was also half closed, legs open, and she was pinned against the wall. There was a possibility that she had been raped.
Detectives in this small parish don't investigate many homicides, let alone one this brutal. They call in the Louisiana State Police to help process the scene.
They took some DNA samples of the material that was found under her fingernails.
The samples are sent to the lab to see if there are any traces of the killer's DNA.
We didn't find any type of murder weapons. We found that it was actually no forced entry. We pretty well figured that it was somebody that she knew and had a little bit of trust in to open the door.
As police collect evidence, Janora's neighbors, Philip and Amy Skipper, arrive on the scene.
They was, of course, shocked. Philip's wife, Amy, she was really destroyed, and she was a friend of Miss Guillory's.
Police informed Janora's family. Her brother-in-law, Albert, is the first to get the terrible news.
I received a call from the sheriff's office indicating that Janora was dead, had been murdered, and obviously it was just an unbelievably bad moment. To Janora's sister, my spouse at that time, Yvonne, that was probably the single most devastating moment in her life.
The family rushes to the scene. When they arrive, detectives ask them for any details they can provide about Janora.
Janora grew up in Eunice, Louisiana, a small town in St. Landry Parish. From the time that Janora was a young girl in school, she was a very giving person. She was a very intelligent woman, filled with love for life, filled with love for animals.
Janora worked at an insurance company in Baton Rouge, but chose to live in rural Clinton, where she could indulge in her passion for animals.
She had 30 dogs, she had 3 or 4 horses, she had rescue animals, she took care of friends' animals if they couldn't. Animals were a big part of her life.
Friends were a big part of Janora's life too. She was thrilled when a sweet couple moved in across the street, and they immediately hit it off.
Philip and Amy Skipper moved into her neighborhood, and I felt very comfortable that she had developed this warm relationship with the Skippers.
Over the years, Janora and her neighbors became close friends.
Janora told me how reliable they were and how hardworking they were.
Janora really liked her neighbors, and she thought of the Skippers almost like family.
Now her friends are heartbroken over Janora's violent death, and police are faced with the puzzle of finding her killer.
It made no sense. Janora had no enemies, and she wasn't involved in anything shady or suspicious.
When the autopsy report comes back the next day, it concludes that the murder took place between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. It also reveals just how brutal Janora's final moments were. She was shot 5 times with a .22 caliber gun and stabbed 5 times. But neither of these attacks caused her death.
A severe blow to the back of the head severed her brainstem from her body. She was actually alive, and she was fighting back and was stabbed and shot.
This was one of the most violent homicides that I've worked. It was a very much overkill, which usually means it is a crime of passion.
This was a particularly brutal, dastardly deed. We all stood outside Janora's house that morning and talked about who could possibly have done this.
Despite the concern of Janora's family and friends, detectives can't rule out anyone as a suspect.
We began talking to the neighbors and co-workers, the ones that showed up, and just started trying to get information.
One person in particular draws investigators' attention: Janora's neighbor, Philip Skipper.
Philip was real calm. What really got me was his over wanting to help too much, you know. We just had a feeling Philip knew something.
Coming up, investigators uncover a dark obsession.
He was infatuated with her and couldn't take no for an answer.
and menacing secrets.
They called her names behind her back all the time, but never to her face.
There was an incentive for them to actually murder her.
That leads them to a suspect they never expected.
They went on a tour of the murder scene, and he described the whole thing.
He just blurted out, "Do you have a woman named Mrs. G that was murdered over there?"
After 42-year-old Genora Guillory is found savagely killed in her home, detectives in Clinton, Louisiana suspect that her neighbor, Philip Skipper, might know something about the murder.
Philip was over helpful at the crime scene, and it is something that we wanted to check out more.
Police decide to bring in Philip Skipper and his wife, Amy, for an interview.
Genora really liked her neighbors, and the Skippers had a young child and their stepson, who was 15 years old at the time.
Philip Skipper tells investigators that when his young family first moved to Clinton, they were down on their luck, but their neighbor Genora kindly helped out.
She started to take them under her umbrella and make sure that they had food and made sure that they had electricity.
When the Skippers needed extra money for baby food or diapers, Genora was always there. The trailer they were living in, for example, was really dilapidated, so Genora helped them buy a new trailer. She helped them improve their lives as much as she could.
Genora's kindness didn't stop there.
She started to employ Philip to do all of the work in her yard and around the house, and employed Amy Skipper to do the work inside her house.
Genora treated the Skippers like family and trusted them with keys to her property.
She was just a very, very generous neighbor.
Detectives want to know if the Skippers ever argued with Genora. Amy Skipper said their relationship had recently been strained by an unfortunate incident.
Philip Skipper was raising pit bulls, and there was one dog that was not a pit that didn't get along with his other pit bulls, and Genora agreed to keep that in her kennel with her dogs. Well, that dog somehow got loose during the day while Genora was at work. The dog ran back to the Skipper's trailer and killed a goat. They kept it as a pet. Amy Skipper ran over to Genora's house, got on the phone, called Genora at work, and was upset with Genora. Now that's witnessed by a couple of Genora's co-workers who heard Genora's end of the conversation. She was crying by the end of this phone call. That's how upset Genora was. And Genora told Amy Skipper on the phone, "Leave the key at my house, get out of my house, and never come back."
When police question Philip about the conflict, he tells them that he and Amy had since patched things up with Genora, and they were back on friendly terms.
Philip Skipper was dismissive about the falling out. He said it was just a dispute among neighbors, and they worked it out, and there was no lingering after effects.
Police are skeptical about Philip's version of events, and when they notice scratches on his arms, they wonder if they were made by Genora while trying to fight for her life.
Questioned him about that. He said it was from him and his stepson wrestling in the yard.
Not convinced by his story, investigators ask Philip where he was on the night of the murder.
And he said he was asleep at the time that the murder happened.
To confirm Philip's story, police ask to interview his 15-year-old stepson, John Ballio.
When you interview the juveniles in Louisiana, you have to have permission of the guardian or the parent. which we had. I mean, they did cooperate there and let us talk to them.
When detectives questioned John, they noticed scratches on his arms too. Is it possible Genora fought back against two attackers?
John Ballio had marks on him. He gave us the same story.
John corroborates his stepdad's story. But police are still suspicious.
The marks on their arms was really something that we wanted to check out more if they was being truthful. So after that interview, we did decide to have a polygraph set up.
Philip and John agree to take the test, but before it can be scheduled, investigators uncover a critical detail.
During the course of the investigation, we did learn about an insurance policy Miss Guillory had taken out on herself, and the money would go to the skippers.
Was an insurance payout reason enough for the skippers to kill their friend and neighbor?
With a lack of motive, it's really hard to find the killer.
The insurance policy was an incentive for them to actually murder her.
Police have just discovered that murder victim Genora Guillory's neighbors, the Skipper family, are the beneficiaries of Genora's $25,000 life insurance policy.
And it's just kind of unusual that the neighbor would have an insurance policy and list the other neighbor as a beneficiary. They're not related.
The insurance policy raises eyebrows for investigators, but Genora's family is well aware of the policy and does not suspect foul play.
Genora wanted to make sure that the skippers had the food that they needed, had the clothing that they needed for at least a period of time, should she meet an untimely departure. The skippers, after Genora's death, did not know how to collect. They contacted me and asked me to assist them, and I did.
Still, police believe the insurance money is a possible motive. That, coupled with the scratches on Philip and John's arms, convinces detectives to take the next step.
Philip Skipper and John Ballio showed up at the Baton Rouge Police Department, which has a polygraphy unit, and they both took separate polygraph tests.
The polygraph interrogator asked 15-year-old John Ballio for an alibi.
John Ballio said he was at home asleep when the murders occurred.
Both John and Philip are asked about their knowledge of the murder by the examiner. And when their responses are analyzed, detectives are surprised by the results.
Both of their tests came back with no real signs of deception.
The results on the polygraphs, they was inconclusive, and the officer that was doing the polygraph didn't think that they had done the murder.
The results are a blow to the investigation, and lead detectives drop the skippers as suspects.
We still didn't have no physical evidence. And the polygraph made us think, well, we need to start looking elsewhere.
Detectives interview Genora's friends and coworkers about anyone she may have dated recently.
The friend of Miss Guillory's did give us the name of Tommy Alexandra.
Police track down Tommy at his home in a nearby town. He agrees to talk to police. Tommy tells investigators that he met Genora months prior at a feed store where she was stocking up on food for her animals. Genora agreed to meet Tommy for a drink, their first of several dates.
Tommy and Genora had dated on and off for some time.
But it soon became apparent to Genora that Tommy had other love interests.
It turned out Tommy Alexander was not just dating Genora at the time. He was dating a couple of different women.
Genora really liked him, but Tommy didn't want to settle down. He wasn't going to commit to one woman.
Is it possible that an argument between Genora and Tommy could have turned deadly?
We interviewed Tommy about the homicide.
On the night Genora was murdered, Tommy says that he was at home. Police talk to his girlfriend, who confirms his alibi.
They were able to eventually eliminate him as a suspect. As far as physical evidence to tie a specific suspect to the scene, there really wasn't anything. They kept trying to dig for facts, but they were hampered by the fact that, once again, they couldn't figure out why anyone wanted to kill her.
Determined to get justice for Genora, investigators interview her coworkers and discover that she had an ongoing conflict with a man in her life.
We learned about another friend, Steve Williams, from co-workers, and basically what we learned is that he wanted to date Miss Guillory.
But the feeling is not mutual.
Steve Williams managed to persuade Genora to go out one time, and that was enough for her. She didn't want to go out with him again, and she let him know. But he didn't take that no very well.
Miss Guillory had really got concerned about him, according to her friends. He would sit out in the parking lot and wait for her to get off from work, would show up unannounced.
Steve Williams showed up out of the blue while she was working her horses.
He pursued her a little more aggressively than was comfortable for the family.
From co-workers' explanations over there, he seemed to be stalking Genora.
Genora said, "He's bothering me and he needs to stop."
When detectives look into Steve Williams, they're shocked to learn that their potential suspect is one of their own.
Steve Williams was a Baton Rouge police officer.
Detectives have learned that Steve Williams, who had been repeatedly contacting Genora Guillory in the months before her murder, is a fellow police officer.
Steve Williams had recently gotten a job with the Baton Rouge Police Department, and he was a probationary police officer in the next jurisdiction over.
He was infatuated with her, and he was just a guy who couldn't take no for an answer.
Genora's friends knew that she was not interested, and of course after the murder, when the police are asking, well, who may have been upset with Genora, he became a focus of the investigation.
When you investigate law enforcement officers, it's harder than most because they know the law as good as you do. But we did have good cooperation through Baton Rouge City Police Department. Whatever we needed, they was willing to provide.
As investigators gather more information about Steve, they uncover an intriguing tip from one of his colleagues, 29-year-old officer Tabitha McCants.
Tabitha came forward during the investigation, and she had worked with Steve Williams at Baton Rouge Police Office.
It turns out she got kind of a bad vibe from him.
Tabitha tells investigators that she overheard Steve having heated phone conversations with a woman on several occasions while at the police shooting range.
She said they'd make multiple phone calls.
Police need to check Genora's phone records to find out if Genora was the person Steve had been calling. Tabitha also tells investigators that Steve mentioned shooting targets at his mother's home. And when they ask Tabitha if Steve mentioned the type of gun he used, her answer sets off alarm bells.
She says he used a .22, which by this time we found out that .22 was used in the shooting of Miss Guillory.
As a police officer, of course, Steve Williams had firearms. The .22 caliber pistol, which is certainly not a police gun, but he did have a .22, and he shot it at his mother's house.
Based on the history of him stalking Miss Guillory and the access to a .22, that's when we decided that we would check Steve Williams out a little bit more.
When detectives check Janora's phone records, they quickly discover an alarming pattern.
Looking at the phone records, Steve Williams, in my opinion, was stalking Miss Guillory.
The phone records showed 35 calls to Janora's home from the shooting range in 4 months, and an escalating pattern of calls and messages.
Steve Williams had left several messages for Janora the weekend that she was killed. In fact, he told her in a message that he would stop by her house on the day she was killed.
Investigators don't waste a second bringing Steve in for questioning, and when they do, his demeanor has them instantly suspicious.
Steve was real nervous. It was just something about him, like he was hiding something from us.
Steve insists he had nothing to do with Janora's murder and claims he stayed at his mother's house the night Janora was killed.
Steve's mama's residence, about 40 minutes away from where the homicide was.
Police believe Janora was murdered between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Could Steve have slipped out undetected while his mother was sleeping?
Janora was shot with a .22 caliber pistol, and the fact that he had a .22, was nearby on the day she was killed, it really put him very high up on the suspect list.
That's when we had him take a polygraph.
Steve's answers are analyzed and the results sent to detectives.
Steve Williams' polygraph examination came back with some clear signs that he was possibly being deceptive.
His polygraph basically told us that he may have known something about the murder. Made me really think that he had something to do with this. That's when Steve advised he wasn't going to talk to us no more. He wanted a lawyer.
Despite Steve's refusal to cooperate, detectives continue to investigate him.
He looked like a good suspect. Now the question would be, can they find the evidence to prove it? They got a warrant for his house, they got warrants for his personal cars, and they got a warrant for his police car. Now, to do that, they had to work with the Baton Rouge Police Department. And the detectives were hoping to recover a .22, knife, anything with bloodstains, anything to link him to the crime scene. They didn't find anything.
It's a major setback. But detectives still have one last piece of forensic evidence that they believe could connect Steve Williams to the murder. They get a search warrant for a DNA sample from Steve to see if it's a match for genetic material found on Janora's body.
We had those fingernail scrapings that were taken off her from the State Police Crime Lab.
It was determined, yes, there was some male DNA under her fingernails.
Coming up, investigators zero in on a vicious killer.
I picked out the worst photo that I could find of the crime scene, and I threw it in front of his face and made him look at it and said, did she deserve it?
Police hope to use DNA evidence to link Baton Rouge police officer Steve Williams to Janora Guillory's murder. Steve's DNA is compared to material found under Janora's fingernails.
His DNA was not actually determined to be under her fingernails.
The DNA also doesn't match any known criminals in the FBI database.
The fingernail scrapings came back to unknown male genetic profile.
With no physical evidence linking Steve Williams to the crime, he's ruled out as a suspect, leaving investigators at a standstill.
The case had gone cold, and they had no other leads to check into.
The case stays cold for an entire year.
There was great disappointment and great frustration on the part of the family when the case went cold.
The shock of Janora's murder may have faded, but the community lives in fear of a killer who's still at large.
When a murder occurs, it's very alarming. Everybody's on edge, especially after the case was at a standstill.
Then, on July 27, 2001, a tip comes in that changes everything.
And I got a call on the telephone straight to the office. It was Detective Mark Apperson from Tangipahoa Sheriff's Office. And he just blurted out, he's like, "Do you have a woman named Mrs. G that was murdered over there?" And I just kind of looked over at Don and I said, "Yeah, we do have a woman named Miss G that was killed."
The detective there was working a domestic violence battery, and the victim had came in and told him that her boyfriend knew something about a murder in Clinton.
The woman tells detectives her boyfriend's name is Donnie Fisher.
We rode over there and found Donnie Fisher. We brought him over there to the Tangipahoa Sheriff's Office.
But Donnie Fisher is not in the mood to talk.
You could tell he knew something. That's when I picked out the worst photo that I could find of the crime scene. And I threw it in front of his face and made him look at it and said, "Did she deserve it?"
Reluctantly, Donnie looks down at the gruesome photos, and moments later, his whole demeanor changes.
He started to break down and cry. And he looked at it and then he told us, basically, his confession.
Donnie says he heard a detailed account of the murder from one of Janora's neighbors.
The neighbor took Donnie Fisher on a tour of the murder scene.
He said once they got there, he took them and said, "This is how it happened."
Investigators are stunned. They question all of Janora's neighbors at the outset of the investigation, but it didn't uncover any useful information or lead to an arrest. Detectives demand that Donnie reveal the neighbor's name.
He said it was John Ballio, Philip Skipper's stepson.
Detectives are shocked. They press Donnie for details, and he claims that John told him about the murder while cleaning up Janora Guillory's house.
Janora Guillory's family had hired John Ballio to go clean up the crime scene. Donnie Fisher, he was out there helping, so as they're cleaning up the house, John Ballio was bragging to Donnie Fisher about how he killed Janora Guillory. John Ballio took Donnie and said, "Here's what we did here, here's what we did here," and he described the whole thing.
Investigators don't know whether to believe Donnie's story, especially since John Ballio's polygraph was considered truthful. Yet every word of it lines up with the evidence.
John actually showed Donnie how Miss G ran through the house, and talking to Donnie, he described everything that we'd put together from what we seen at the crime scene.
Detectives want to know, why would Ballio want Janora dead after all she had done for his family?
Miss Guillory would rather help somebody than hurt somebody, you know. She would do anything she could to help the Skippers.
It's kind of heartbreaking.
Police now believe that Donnie is telling the truth, so they quickly file an arrest warrant.
We picked up John Ballio late on a Friday evening, and we brought him back to East Feliciana Sheriff's Office for the charges of first-degree murder.
Investigators now believe the key to cracking this case is a confession from the alleged killer. Luckily, a recent change in Louisiana state law allows them to question a minor accused of murder without a lawyer or guardian present.
The police had to get John Ballio to come clean and tell the truth.
We brought him to my office and advised him of his rights.
He bounced from here to there during his statements at first when we initially questioned him. And then we started talking about the brutality of this homicide.
After probably an hour, hour and a half interviewing, he finally came and told the story about how he killed Miss G.
But first, Ballio needs to get something off his chest.
He didn't do it by himself.
Pointing the finger right back at Philip Skipper.
Detectives are speechless. John Ballio just implicated his stepdad, Philip, in the murder of Jenora Guillory. And that's not all.
He pointed to several other people, too.
Detectives in Clinton, Louisiana have just arrested Philip Skipper's stepson, John Ballio, for the murder of 42-year-old Jenora Guillory.
John started basically telling us how this went down.
And John claims he didn't act alone. He points the finger at his stepdad, Philip Skipper, and two other people.
Johnny Hoyt was a brother-in-law to Philip Skipper, and Lisa Skipper Hoyt was a sister to Philip Skipper. He said they killed this woman together.
Lisa and Johnny, that's the first time their name had ever came up. And we were, of course, shocked.
John Ballio gave a detailed confession on videotape to exactly what happened.
John claims that Philip, Johnny, and Lisa had formed a white supremacist gang called the Brotherhood, and that killing Jenora was meant to be John's initiation into the group.
It would be my true test of brotherhood.
It was a skinhead gang. Actually, they were very anti-black and neo-Nazi.
Philip Skipper, he had two completely different faces on him. I mean, he had the one he presented to Jenora Guillory, which was, the nice neighbor. And then behind her back, he called her all kind of names. He hated black people.
He basically made her believe that he was her knight in shining armor. She never saw it coming.
Killing Jenora would not only initiate Ballio into their gang, but also bring a financial windfall.
Philip Skipper was smart enough to figure out that, hey, if she doesn't like us anymore, it's not going to be very long before she changes that insurance policy and names someone else as beneficiary.
Ballio tells detectives that on the night of the murder, the group had been drinking heavily. They arrived at Jenora's door at 2 a.m.
When we got there, Lisa walked up to the door and knocked on it and told Miss G that she needed some money to get the baby some diapers.
And Miss G cracked the door open. That's when Johnny hit her and forced his way in there.
They just jumped on her like a pack of hyenas.
She ran through the house, down the hall, screaming for him to leave her alone. And she ran into the kitchen and got to the knife drawer trying to get her knife so she could cut him to make him leave her alone.
Eventually, she ran to her bedroom.
John told us that they took turns stabbing her, and they took turns beating her, and they took turns shooting her.
And then somebody threw the final blow that, according to the medical examiner, killed her instantly. It was a blow with a bat to the head.
Philip started hitting her with the bat. And after Miss G stopped breathing, they started raping her.
John Ballio said that they used condoms. There was not an indication of any seminal fluid or any semen at the scene that night.
With no evidence to back up John Balio's claim of sexual assault, the rape charges are dropped. But detectives are still determined to bring Janora's killers to justice.
John Balio's confession gave us enough probable cause to make sure this case got prosecuted.
For cooperating with police, John is given a deal. He pleads guilty to second-degree murder and receives a juvenile life sentence to expire when he turns 21. Lisa Hoyt also takes a plea agreement and is sentenced to 25 years. That leaves Johnny Hoyt and Philip Skipper to face justice in separate trials. When news of the arrests gets out, Janora's family is devastated.
When the family found that Philip and John were involved, they were really, really upset and angry that the people that Janora had taken care of so diligently were the ones involved in her murder.
The prosecutors are determined to bring Janora's killers to justice, but they have a problem. There's no concrete evidence linking either Philip or Johnny to the crime scene.
There was some male DNA under her fingernails, but it did not match the samples that we had from the 3 males in this case.
Both cases rest entirely on the testimony of John Balio.
John Balio walked us through what happened that night, and that was crucial for our case. He actually brought everything together and made the whole situation make sense to a jury. It was Philip Skipper's trial. The jury came back with a unanimous verdict. He was guilty of second-degree murder.
Philip Skipper is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Philip's wife, Amy, is not charged with any crime.
A lot of times people ask, what about Amy? What about Amy? Amy Skipper had no idea what her husband was doing.
I genuinely believe that Amy Skipper did not have any knowledge of what was going to take place. I believe that she had nothing to do with this.
Johnny Hoyt was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole. But for the family of Janora Guillory, no punishment could possibly make up for the pain they suffered in the wake of her murder.
Janora's father died of a broken heart. It was just a very, very difficult time for everyone in that family. I'd like for people to remember Janora as we knew her, warm and happy, and someone who would give the shirt off her back to anyone who needed it. We are all happy to have had our lives enriched by her passage through this life.
A beloved mother and friend.
Sarah was the sweetest person on this earth.
She wanted to do anything for you to make you happy.
Murdered in her home.
Just the sheer brutality. Somebody was out of control.
It was so terrifying. It was so frightening.
Sends police on the hunt for a killer.
Possible suspect right away is her husband.
And they find out, uh-oh, there's someone else involved with this person.
You were just sitting there wondering, are they ever gonna find who did this?
But the search for the truth.
This is strange. There were so many twists and turns. What really happened?
Uncovers a culprit.
Something's going on here. They were never even on the suspect radar.
That surprises everyone.
Wow, that was a twist none of us expected.
It was shocking.
No, this isn't right.
I never expected that someone like that could be evil.
Howard County, Maryland.
an affluent community nestled between Baltimore and Washington, D.C.
Howard County itself is a very quiet, peaceful suburb.
Howard County is very much a bedroom community. People move here for the schools. That's what it's known for. There's very, very little crime.
But on Sunday, November 15th, 1998, at 7:44 p.m., a concerned resident makes a call to police.
I have a friend who I normally hear from every day, and I haven't heard from her all day, and there's a really funny message on my machine from last night. And I wondered if someone could drive by her house and check it out.
What's your lady's name?
Sarah Roris.
I did not hear from Sarah all day. That is not normal. Something's wrong.
Laura tells police that the 35-year-old single mother lives with her 1-year-old son, but the boy is with his father this weekend. Patrol officers head to the Roris home in the township of Elkridge to investigate.
The police were able to gain access to the house, and upon entering the house, they conducted a sweep, and in the back family room, they found the body of Sarah Roris. It appeared that she'd been stabbed to death.
Even hardened homicide investigators are taken aback when they see Sarah's mutilated body.
The thing that still sticks in my mind is just the sheer brutality. I can close my eyes and see it as vividly today as I did then. The ones most visible were wounds to Sarah's neck and throat, multiple deep cuts and slashes. She was basically just short of being decapitated. She had severe cuts to each wrist. Her hands were just short of being cut completely off. There was a series of stab wounds to her stomach. Tremendous amount of blood on the floor around her, blood spattered up and down the walls. There was blood splattered all over the child's toys. It was complete and utter overkill. Somebody was out of control.
Could the vicious nature of the attack mean this was a crime of passion? Detectives hunt for clues to help piece together this gruesome event.
It was apparent that she had been dead for a period of time before we discovered her. The blood had pretty much dried. I was estimating she probably had been dead for about 24 hours. It had been forced entry to the house. Bloody boot prints leading from the body indicate that the suspect both entered and exited through the window. There appeared to be some degree of ransacking. VCR appeared to be missing. The phone was missing from the wall. A couple drawers in the kitchen had been rifled through, but at the same time, the victim's laptop, computer, purse, and items were relatively untouched on the kitchen table. An initial thought on our part was, could it all be staging in an attempt to throw us off, to make us think it was a robbery or burglary gone bad?
Looking for witnesses, police fan out to speak with Sarah's neighbors on her quiet suburban street.
As brutal and as violent as this attack was, nobody heard anything, not a sound.
Inside the house, the forensic team spends hours gathering evidence.
On the wall above Sarah's body, crime scene technicians were able to recover a couple bloody fingerprints. It indicated that the person was wearing gloves.
Investigators must now solve the mystery of why Sarah Roris would fall prey to such a brutal attack. Detectives start by speaking with Sarah's friend, Laura Billiter, who first called police. They have to reveal the heartbreaking news that her friend is dead.
I didn't want it to be true. I was in denial, and you just can't process information for a while. You're frozen. I kept trying to deny that it was Sarah. No one deserves to die like that.
Sarah Williamson was born on a Florida military base in 1963, the daughter of an Air Force sergeant. Growing up, she was gregarious with a knack for mathematics.
Sarah was not your typical introverted mathematician. She was very sociable.
To describe Sarah, she gave love freely. She wanted to do anything for you to make you happy.
After graduating college, Sarah moved to Maryland, where she took a job as a statistician at the National Security Agency.
Sarah and I met at work, and she was the best friend you could ever have. Sarah was the sweetest person on this earth. She had friends everywhere at work. She had built up a reputation for herself. She was well respected. And she always was going to school or improving herself in some way.
In 1991, while earning a master's degree, Sarah met Lorenzo Raris, and they began a relationship. The two married in 1994.
Sarah wanted the husband, the children, the house in the country, the white picket fence. She wanted that golden dream.
After 3 years of marriage, Sarah and Lorenzo had a son, Will.
She was a great mom. She doted on Will.
But the new baby put a strain on the marriage.
Her family was down in Alabama, so she was missing that support system. Lorenzo did very little to help her.
Over the next year, friends saw their relationship deteriorate.
Things really took a downturn. The marriage was breaking down. Sarah, during all that, was a complete mess.
In 1998, Sarah and Lorenzo separated. Eager for a fresh start, Sarah filed for divorce.
She was just becoming a strong woman again, proud of the fact that she was able to live on her own and take care of her child on her own. It was wonderful to see.
Now, 5 months later, Sarah's been found butchered in her own living room. The beloved mother's lifeless body left laying in a pool of blood.
She had become such a strong, independent woman, and I was so proud of her. I was devastated.
Laura gives detectives the phone message from her answering machine that prompted Laura to call police in the first place.
I couldn't understand any of it because it was so garbled. The only thing I knew, somebody was in trouble. I did a redial, and I figured out it was from Sarah.
In listening to the recording, you can hear sounds of a struggle, followed by a series of short, sharp screams. It was 30, 40 seconds, basically, of Sarah being murdered. I believe that she was probably in the process of maybe trying to call 911 when she inadvertently hit the preset speed dial for Laura.
The timestamp on the message is 8:46 p.m. on Saturday night, only 36 hours earlier.
The recording gave us a starting point that we know on this date and this time, Sarah Raris was attacked and murdered.
I could hear her last moments. I was shocked, I was horrified. And then I got angry, and I'm like, you gotta go pick up Lorenzo, he's involved in this.
Laura was aware Sarah was involved in a very bitter and heated custody dispute with her estranged husband. She had real fear that it was not going to end well. So I wanted to talk to the husband.
This is not going to be a random act of violence. This is going to be murder.
Coming up, a hunt for the truth.
Something's going on here. We had to look into the possibility of an affair.
Reveals buried secrets.
We opened the door and he threw up all over the parking lot. He knows something.
And a stunning turn in the case.
I was absolutely shocked. It's like out of a movie.
It was such an unexpected twist.
Hours after discovering the body of 35-year-old Sarah Raris, detectives investigating the murder have a lead. Sarah's friend Laura tells police she suspects Sarah's estranged husband, Lorenzo Raris, might have had something to do with her murder.
We found out that Sarah was involved in an extremely contentious custody divorce situation. internal police records had indicated that the police had responded there at least once before for disturbance between Sarah and her estranged husband.
After Will was born, the marriage really started breaking down. Lorenzo was very jealous of his child because his child was taking away the attention that he had received from Sarah. Sarah told me that he was not happy with that.
Sarah turned to Lorenzo's mother, Amelia, who lived nearby, for help.
Sarah wanted Amelia involved. She was hoping that Amelia would be a calming influence on Lorenzo. And it would also allow, Sarah to spend a little bit more time with Lorenzo.
Instead of getting better, things got worse.
Sarah confided in me his mother was a little too involved doing all of the caregiving, and Lorenzo wanted nothing to do with the day-to-day task that it takes to raise a child. Sarah was very adamant that Lorenzo is his father. He needs to be very involved in taking care of their son.
One morning, I got a phone call. Sarah was hysterical. She and Lorenzo got into an argument. He tried to hit her while she was holding Will, so she had to turn with the baby in her arms, and he had kicked her. She was just distraught. And I come pick her up, and we head straight to the courtroom. We put a restraining order in, and Lorenzo is not allowed back into the house. Lorenzo was extremely mad. Sarah was scared for her life. She was deathly afraid that she was going to be murdered.
Lorenzo Raris is approached by the Howard County Police for questioning.
When Lorenzo was first notified that his wife had been murdered, he covered his face with his hands. He fell to his knees. And in the initial officer's minds, he pretended to be crying and weeping into his hands, and that when he stood up, there was no evidence at all that he had been crying. One of the first things I noticed in dealing with Lorenzo was his lack of reaction, his lack of emotion, his lack of caring was significant. I thought he was smug, I thought he was arrogant. I just sensed he wasn't all that upset by what had happened to Sarah.
Detectives start by asking the 33-year-old sales manager if he had any involvement in Sarah's murder.
He denied it, that he'd had anything to do with it. At the same time, I just felt that there was something off. It was just an instinct on my part, but I couldn't put my finger on it.
Lorenzo offers up his own theory as to who killed Sarah.
He alluded to the fact that Sarah may have been involved or been having an affair with a previous co-worker, but he said that if anything had happened, it would have probably been a result of this affair.
Lorenzo claims the last time he saw Sarah was on Friday morning when he picked up their son for the weekend.
The alibi that he provided for the Saturday night and weekend in question was that he was at home at the family house with the baby. His brother and his parents, who also lived in the house, were there.
Detectives collect evidence from Lorenzo to search against anything found at the crime scene.
We had a search warrant for his person, which allowed us to collect samples of DNA, hair, photographs, and fingerprints.
With nothing concrete to tie Lorenzo to the murder, detectives have to let him go.
Even though everything was pointing towards Lorenzo, he still has an alibi when he's saying he's at home and he's got all these family witnesses. If in fact he did it, we need to start punching holes in the family alibi.
Investigators head to the Raris family home, 30 minutes away in Parkville.
His car was seized, and other detectives then launched into the search of the Raris family home. We conducted interviews with all the family members, including Lorenzo's mother, Amelia. When asked where she was on that Saturday night, she said that she was working. She was a nurse's aide at a local nursing home, so she was at work during the time frame of the homicide.
Amelia tells detectives that another member of the Raris family was at home that night.
Lorenzo's brother, Mike, lived with the Raris family in Parkville. They all lived in the same house. Mike is the younger brother of Lorenzo, but as far as their personalities, there was a distinct difference between the two. He didn't have the same degree of arrogance or smugness about him that Lorenzo had. He appeared to be somewhat timid.
Mike tells police that Lorenzo was at home when he woke up to go work his night shift job.
It's the family saying he was there. A family alibi, in my opinion, has never been rock solid. It has to be investigated.
But a search of the Raris home fails to yield any new clues.
Nothing of evidentiary value came from the Raris house. Nothing of evidentiary value came from his truck. The only thing we walked away with is we had his initial denials and his initial alibi. From that point on, he lawyered up.
As detectives consider their next move, the public concern about the murder of Sarah Raris grows.
This murder sent shockwaves through the Howard County community. It caused major headlines.
There are a lot of Sarahs in this community, so to have a smart, competent, career-driven woman murdered in this way in her house, it was shocking.
With nothing tying Lorenzo to the murder, investigators turn their attention to his allegation that Sarah was having an affair. Could that have led to her death?
We had to look into the possibility of an affair. The former boss that Lorenzo claimed she was having an affair with had to be tracked down and interviewed. The relationship between the two of them, we had to look at it. We had to investigate.
Police investigating the savage murder of Sarah Raris are looking into her estranged husband's claim that Sarah had been having an affair with her former boss.
Lorenzo had implied that Sarah was having an affair with a former co-worker or supervisor, a gentleman by the name of Don Lewis. He had since retired from NSA and was living in Massachusetts.
Detectives travel to Cape Cod to interview Don Lewis. The 51-year-old tells detectives that he is not surprised by Lorenzo's claim of an affair.
Mr. Lewis told us that Lorenzo had emailed accusing him of having an affair with Sarah. He denied it. He said he was a father figure or mentor to Sarah. There was no romantic overtones, and there was no reason for him to kill her, nor did he want anything bad to happen to her.
Don tells detectives he had been shocked to hear news of Sarah's death, and he was at a friend's dinner party hundreds of miles away when it happened.
Mr. Lewis had an alibi for the Saturday night. He was in Massachusetts the night of the murder, and they had a solid alibi.
Detectives reach out to those close to Sarah to learn more about her relationship with her former boss.
Don Lewis was a friend of hers. They did have like a mentor-mentee relationship, but that was all there was to Don Lewis.
It was more like a father-daughter type of relationship. There was never a romance.
The investigation revealed that the affair aspect of it appeared to be pure fabrication on the part of Lorenzo. There was just nothing there.
A week following her death, those closest to Sarah gather to honor her memory.
The church memorial was packed. There was so much love in that room. Everybody showed up. All of her coworkers and friends from work showed up. The police showed up. Lorenzo didn't show up, nor did any of the rest of the family.
I actually covered her memorial service. Her friends were not shy about casting aspersions on Lorenzo Raris, her husband. That's their suspect number one, their prime suspect.
After Sarah's funeral, investigators speak with the medical examiner about what was found during the autopsy.
The cause of death was no surprise. It was massive blood loss due to the lacerations to her throat. She bled out over 80% of her blood volume. Even the pathologist characterized it as complete overkill.
A forensics report reveals no useful fingerprints from the crime scene. But investigators still hold hope for tests on the bloody glove prints found on the wall behind the body.
The blood was sent out for DNA analysis. That takes a little bit of time to obtain.
While they await test results, detectives revisit their strongest lead, the phone message that captured the final moments of Sarah's life.
Other detectives are listening to the tape, and they thought that at some point in the struggle, they heard Sarah utter the name Mike.
Could Sarah be calling out the name of her killer?
Somebody says, oh, right there, it sounds like Mike. I hear Mike. Lorenzo's brother's name is Mike or Michael.
But what possible motive could Mike Rauris have to kill his sister-in-law?
One of the theories that we were kicking around at this point was, could it have been a family member? Because initially all suspicion would have fallen on Lorenzo. And to keep Lorenzo out of it and to maintain the child custody, to have a family member do it, most logical one would have been Mike. He had to be looked at as a potential suspect.
Detectives sit down with Lorenzo's little brother and play him the answering machine message.
The recording was played for him, and Mike was asked, do you hear the name Mike? And he said no, he did not. Mike denied being personally involved in the murder of Sarah. My overall impressions of Mike was, I don't think he had it in him to do something like this, but I had a feeling that there was something playing on him. Again, he was part of Lorenzo's alibi that he was at home at the time of the murder.
Mike sticks to the story he'd previously told police, that when he woke up Saturday evening to go to work, Lorenzo was at home.
Blood was drawn, hairs were pulled. We fingerprinted him, we photographed him. We drove him back to his job. I told him, I said, I think you know what happened. I think you know what is going on. And we opened the door and he threw up all over the parking lot. And I said, whenever you want to come clean on this, you know who to call, and I gave him my card. My partner and I, we both felt he knows something.
Detectives investigating the murder of Sarah Rauris suspect that her brother-in-law, Mike Rauris, might know more about her murder than he is letting on.
My feeling was something's going on here. Maybe if he didn't do it, he definitely knows about it.
Mike's brother and Sarah's estranged husband, Lorenzo Rauris, is still a suspect in Sarah's murder. But both men say they were at home together at the time she was killed.
If there was one avenue to break the Rauris family alibi, I just thought the weak link was going to be Mike. Problem was, the lawyer that was representing Lorenzo got involved, and from that point on, we were not allowed to speak with Mike without counsel being present. That threw up a huge wall.
A month following the murder, the police investigation is at a standstill. But there is one person that investigators think might be able to help.
Lorenzo had been married previously. His first wife, Becky, was still living locally. We thought she's somebody that we could enlist.
Detectives meet with Becky Rauris to ask for her assistance in the investigation.
Once she heard that Sarah had been murdered, Becky actually agreed to help us. She still had some degree of relationship with Lorenzo. They were cordial to each other. Becky agreed to allow us to record her phone calls with Lorenzo. We were hoping to obtain statements from Lorenzo that would incriminate him in the murder.
Becky reaches out to her ex-husband and tries to steer their conversation to Sarah's murder.
She was phenomenal. She conducted a number of controlled calls on our behalf with him. We were hopefully optimistic that we would get something, but he never said anything incriminating to her on those recordings.
Detectives have hit a dead end in their pursuit of Sarah's killer.
I remember cornering the police chief out of like a public event to ask him, hey, any updates on the case? And he obviously said no. There were no updates to give. They had nothing.
I prayed every day that this would be the day that something, would come forth.
Investigators get new hope when DNA analysis of blood from the glove prints at the crime scene comes back.
The blood came back as a mixture of Sarah's DNA and an unknown male. We were confident that we had the killer's DNA because it's mixed with Sarah's blood. If we found that person, then we could definitely put them at the scene with her actually bleeding.
Could this finally be what detectives need to tie Lorenzo to his wife's murder?
We submitted DNA samples from Lorenzo and his brother Mike for DNA comparison. Came back that neither one were a match. Obviously, that was a bit of a blow. I mean, it's very disappointing. Even though everything was pointing towards Lorenzo, it's not him.
In the beginning, it was pretty clear the police thought that her husband played a role in this. She had a very messy divorce going on. There were custody disputes, but the police didn't arrest him. And so there was a real air of mystery about it because the police couldn't figure it out either.
If Lorenzo was not responsible for the murder of Sarah, who could her killer be? And why was the beloved mother killed in such a violent manner? Investigators are back to square one.
Something has got to give on this. You go back through it again. Did I miss something? You have to look at everything. I did contact the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit in Quantico, and they run it against all other cases in the country looking for similarities. Nothing of value came from that.
Detectives also seek help with deciphering the answering machine message from Laura that captured Sarah's attack.
We sent the recording to the FBI to see if they could clean it up and enhance it to try to determine if in fact it was a name. Well, it turned out it's not Mike. The whole thing with hearing the name Mike, I think, in hindsight, was just pure power of suggestion.
When you have a murder of this sort and no arrest, there was a concern and tension in the community as to what kind of person would do something like this.
We had been hammering away on this thing for almost 7, 8 months. At that point, we're kind of like dead in the water. We felt there was nothing else we could do to advance the case.
You were just sitting there wondering, are they ever going to find who did this? You started to lose hope.
Just as the case goes cold, an urgent call comes in from a neighboring jurisdiction.
My partner came running down the hall and says, you need to come down and take this call. I have Baltimore County Homicide on the phone. You need to hear this. We got it. We got this case.
The 7-month hunt for the killer of Sarah Raris is at a standstill when detectives investigating the murder receive an unexpected phone call.
Picked up the phone, and it was Detective Phil Morrill from Baltimore County. He says, hey, I just got done running a wired conversation with an inmate in the Baltimore County Detention Center, talking about how he committed this murder of a woman. He described how he went through the window and how he attacked her, and how he stabbed her in the belly. And he said, I damn near took her head off. And he says, do you guys have anything like it? And I said, oh yeah, we do. The murder of Sarah Raris. And he said, well, you need to hear this tape.
Howard County investigators get a copy of the jailhouse recording of Ardale Tickles, who had been locked up for an armed robbery 3 months ago.
We sat down and we started listening to the tape of Ardale Tickles. Tickles is describing this homicide that he had committed.
Yeah, the one that I killed. So I dropped through the window. He was like, no, don't kill me, please don't. And I started driving her in the belly. And blood was just gushing out. On her wrist, there was no blood. I took the knife and I just took her head off.
Tickles is describing things that only the police and the suspect would know, all the injuries that had been inflicted upon Sarah. None of that had been released. None of that had been made public. I knew now we had it. I mean, I'm confident Ardell Tickles committed this murder.
Tickles keeps talking and has an even bigger revelation.
He's talking about how he came to be employed to do this.
I got paid, you know what I'm saying, to let you know I was working at. He told me to go hit this place on. He just gave me the head to do it, I went to go do it.
It's now a straight-up murder for hire. We had the actual physical killer of Sarah Raris. We needed the person who hired him and paid him to conduct the murder, a co-worker. We had some homework to do.
Who was this mysterious co-worker? What was her relation to Sarah? And why would she want Sarah killed? Investigators start with Ardell Tickles.
He's 19 years old. He's a kid at this point. He was incarcerated awaiting trial. He robbed the McDonald's and he shot the manager during the course of the robbery. When we started digging into him, we couldn't find any kind of criminal record with him prior to this.
Detectives checked Tickles' employment history, looking for any intersection with Sarah's life or those that knew her.
We went back like a year. He was employed in the laundry room at a local nursing home in Baltimore. He did the laundry for this facility.
The entire investigation turns when detectives realize who also worked at the same nursing home.
Lorenzo's mother, Amelia, they were co-workers. That was kind of mind-blowing, you know. She was never even on the suspect radar. Him and Amelia working at the same nursing home, it was the one piece to the puzzle that you needed to put in, and the rest of them just kind of fell into place after that.
Could it really be true that this 63-year-old grandmother hired someone to kill her daughter-in-law? And if it is true, who else knew about it?
We still weren't convinced that Lorenzo was completely blameless in this. So there was still a lot of investigative work to do. The Raris house in Parkville was put under surveillance while we investigated the relationship between Tickles and Amelia. We matched up work schedules, so we were able to establish, yes, they worked together, yes, they worked the same hours. We were able to locate a few co-workers who remember seeing Amelia talking to this guy. We were able to show that relationship did in fact exist.
But even with a known relationship, police had no evidence Amelia plotted to murder Sarah. To get to the truth, investigators turned to the man they believe killed Sarah.
Tickles was brought in to try to elicit his cooperation. What he gives up, we can use.
Detectives play Tickles the jailhouse recording.
I had the tape recording set to a point where he admits to stabbing her. He heard his voice talk about the murder. As you can see, we don't need your confession. No, we got it.
Can you please enlighten me on what I'm facing and what I'm dealing with in this case?
You're going to be charged with one count of first-degree murder. But we need to get some details worked out. The person we want is this woman that hired you. I had a picture of Amelia. I said, is this the woman? And he says, yeah, that's her. We got her. I mean, it was huge. In some respects, it validated what we thought all along, that everything originated in the Raris household, in the Raris family. Never in 100 years would we have thought that she's the one that was calling the shots. What did she say to you?
Told her she couldn't go on with life and told this lady was dead. She was like, do me a favor and kill this lady, basically.
So she used the word kill?
Kill, take him off the earth, yeah. She said, I'll pay you. She said, I'll give you money.
If you hire somebody to commit a murder and that person carries it out, then you're susceptible to the same charges and the same penalties as the person who did the actual killing. So now we're looking at first-degree murder charges for Amelia. After it was over with, Did you call this woman that night?
No, I met her at work, like that week.
Okay, is that when she paid you?
Yeah, she had a bundle with like $3,000.
Despite Tickle's revelations, investigators know it will be hard to bring charges against Amelia on the word of a jailed offender.
We had enough. We could have easily arrested Tickles and called it case closed. We needed something that really implicated Amelia in the conspiracy. What we wanted him to do to nail down the first-degree murder charge was get on the phone and call Amelia. We wanted to run a controlled call with him, and he refused. When that didn't happen, we had some work to do.
Investigators now suspect Sarah Raris was murdered in a hit organized by her mother-in-law, Amelia Raris. But the hitman, Ardale Tickles, refuses to take part in a wiretap to implicate her.
I would have loved to have got this controlled phone call to Amelia to further establish Amelia's involvement in the planning of the murder, but we still felt we were on the right track. A big item of evidence in this case obviously would be follow the money. We pulled Amelia's financial records and found out, sure enough, Amelia wrote a check out in the amount that Tickles says he got paid, and she wrote it out to cash. That was key. That's the money trail.
Amelia Raris is arrested and interviewed by detectives.
She acknowledged her relationship with Tickles, and she also acknowledged that she hired him, but she alleged that she did not hire him to kill her. He did that on his own, she said. I just wanted to scare her.
There was no intention to kill her. I didn't know that it's like that. In fact, I thought he's not going to kill her. He is just going to stone the house. You know, you throw the stone there.
$3,000 to stone the house?
Yes, to stone the house. And make her feel sorry as a revenge for me.
Amelia told us she wanted Sarah scared because she felt that Sarah, throughout their relationship, had disrespected her, did not acknowledge her as a woman with more maternal experience.
Because of the child?
Because of the child. I am not welcome to help. I think she did not like my style. The mother in my culture is revered and respected. I want to be treated with respect. I'm her mother. My marriage, she disrespected me. That is a slap on my face, and it is given mortal death to me.
I understand. You were insulted.
Oh my God. Million words more than that. Showing disrespect to a mother is death.
Is it enough, though, to have someone to do it?
Yes, because it killed me.
I think she was trying to portray herself as this poor little old lady who was as much a victim as anything. We weren't buying any of it. I mean, it's pure evil. There's no other way to describe, what happened here.
Then, detectives ask Amelia the question they've been trying to answer since day one.
Is Lorenzo involved?
No.
Does he know to this day what happened?
No. I do not want to tell my son. Because if I tell him, he will have problems. He loves the woman very much.
He's still in love with her?
Yeah.
Does Michael know anything about this?
No. I will not tell him.
Despite Amelia's claim that she had no intention for Sarah to be killed, police proceed with charges against her.
We were able to establish that she hired him and paid him. That gave us more than enough to further solidify the case we had against her already.
The case against Ardale Tickles is strengthened when tests match his DNA to blood evidence found at the crime scene.
Both Ardale Tickles and Amelia Raris were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and in Amelia's case, she was charged with the crime of solicitation.
When we first heard that it was Amelia, the feeling was, no, this isn't right.
When I found out about her, I'm like, where the heck did Amelia come from?
I was absolutely shocked that the mother-in-law orchestrated the entire thing, and it was a hitman who did it, was, wow, that was a twist none of us expected. Like, there's no way. It's like out of a movie.
In January of 2000, both Ardale Tickles and Amelia Raris faced trial for the murder of Sarah Raris.
There was no trial for Ardale Tickles.
He was going to go to trial, and Ardale Tickles unexpectedly decides to plead guilty. He's completely remorseful. He says, you know, I shouldn't have done it. And then he got life in prison from the judge.
Amelia Raris enters a plea of not guilty.
She maintained her innocence that she had just paid this guy $3,000 to go throw stones at the house.
I testified at the trial. I was there to let the jury know who Sarah was. I was afraid they would see the sweet, meek little old lady and not believe that someone like that could be evil and could organize this murder.
Ardale Tickles refuses to testify, but prosecutors present the recording of his police interview describing the plot and the crime, as well as the telephone message that captured Sarah's last moments of life.
It was so terrifying. It was so frightening. It was so unspeakably brutal. It was chilling.
After a 7-day trial, Amelia Raris is found guilty of all charges. She is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
I was relieved when the guilty verdict was read, and I am glad that they saw through that demeanor that she put on.
For those closest to Sarah, there will always be a void left behind.
She gave joy, she received joy. I really do miss her. I need to hear her laugh.
We lost a really good person that day. We lost a light. And I just hope that, you know, she's happy in God's arms and that she's looking out for Will. I miss her so much.
A loving and outgoing mother of 3.
Everybody wanted to be around her and her energy and her beauty.
She was an incredible human being and a great mother.
Is found murdered in a farmer's field.
There was numerous blunt force trauma injuries.
Cuts, lacerations, bruising throughout her body.
This poor woman was brutally attacked and murdered.
As detectives hunt the killer, they unearth dark secrets.
All the information kept leading us to think that he was trying to find a way out of this relationship.
He would throw stuff, break stuff. It was really controlling. He was really manipulative.
They had an argument, something happened, it went too far.
Then, new revelations turn the case on its head.
In the video, there is a male party following her into the darkness.
I had absolutely nothing to do with. What did you have nothing to do with?
And points to a predator no one saw coming.
It was definitely a very big twist.
When the news came out, he made me sick when I saw him. He looked like a monster.
Green Bay, Wisconsin is a relatively small, close-knit community where a lot of people know each other. Obviously, our claim to fame is having the Green Bay Packers in town here. So during football season, pretty much everything centers around that.
It's 100% a place that you would want to raise a family.
The crime rate in the Green Bay area is generally very low, especially when it comes to violent crime.
On a warm May afternoon in 2016, nearby Brown County Sheriff's Office gets a troubling 911 call from a local farmer.
Brown County 911, what's your emergency?
Oh, God. We just found a human body.
Is it a male or a female?
It's got long hair, but I didn't go near it. I'm about at the top of a hill just looking down on it.
The 911 call was from farmers working in a field, and they located a body.
Investigators race to the farmer's field on the outskirts of Green Bay.
The body was behind a brushy, woody area, not visible by the road itself.
It was laying face down with arms spread across the front of her head and feet towards the road. The victim was a blonde female, approximately in her 30s. Past that, we really didn't have any identifying information other than the pink wristband on her wrist. There was a distinct pattern that we found on the victim's back, which appeared to be from the sole of a shoe.
It wasn't until the body was turned that all the injuries were located.
The extent of injuries that she suffered were pretty horrific. There was trauma to her neck that would indicate possible strangulation, in addition to lacerations, bruising throughout her body. Her fingernails were damaged, indicative of defensive wounds. That tells us that she was fighting for her life.
There were nail clippings taken for the potential of any DNA from the suspect underneath her fingernails.
We were looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. However, the search of the area didn't reveal anything.
After questioning the farmer and clearing him of any suspicion, investigators try to determine how the victim ended up in his field.
The area was searched thoroughly for any clothing that may have been left behind, any other tracks, footprints.
There were a set of tire tracks that went from the driveway to where the victim's body was found and then circled back towards the driveway. The farmers work in the field were using a skidster and a four-wheeler, and they definitely didn't match those pieces of equipment.
We definitely felt like this was likely the suspect vehicle that was used to transport the body there.
As detectives continue to process the crime scene, the local sheriff's office receives another call.
Brown County Public Safety, this is Therese.
How do I go about, with missing person?
Okay, and who's missing?
My girlfriend.
What's her name?
Nicole Vanderheiden.
Our dispatch center received a phone call from a party named Doug Dietrich reporting that he did not know where his girlfriend was. And the last he had seen or heard from her was the night before.
We felt very strongly that the missing person report was going to involve the victim we had in the field.
Officers from the crime scene are dispatched to interview the caller, 34-year-old Doug Dietrich, who lived with his girlfriend, Nicole Vanderheiden.
Is Doug here?
Hello.
Hi. I'm here for a missing persons report.
As allowed by Wisconsin law, officers secretly film the conversation.
It was important to record the interview with Doug. Based on the victim in the field, it's always in the back of our mind that this could be some kind of domestic violence issue that happened.
Doug looked completely hungover. He had really dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I asked him why he's making this missing persons report.
Nobody's seen or heard from her since last night, but I'd say midnight, yeah.
Okay. Doug indicated that he and Nikki joined a group of friends out at a local establishment to participate in watching a live band.
Doug provides a telling detail when asked what Nikki was wearing.
She would have had a bracelet on.
Okay.
It was a pink bracelet for the 21 verification.
There was a wristband that the victim was wearing. So based on that information, we were quite certain that it was Nikki that we were with in the field.
As police work to confirm that the victim in the field is 31-year-old mother of three, Nicole Vanderheiden, they learn more about her background.
Nikki was born in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Then she went to high school here. She was the most amazing, inspiring, beautiful, happy woman I have ever met in my life. She always enjoyed being around family.
After high school, Nikki attended the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, graduating in 2010.
Nikki's background included a double major in science and education. From that, she was a substitute school teacher.
Nikki was one of the hardest workers I've known. She always had 2 jobs as a substitute teacher and waitressing.
Outside of work, Nikki was dedicated to fitness.
She definitely took care of herself, and she worked out a lot. Everybody wanted to be around her and her energy and her beauty. We always complimented how beautiful she was, and she was, inside and out.
In 2005, Nikki got married and had 2 children, but the marriage ended in 2012.
Nikki was definitely a hands-on mom. I think it made her proud to be able to do that, because being a single mother is not easy.
Then, in 2015, Nikki met Doug Dietrich.
Nikki and Doug had a spark. They moved very quickly and got pregnant, and she was so excited to become a mother of 3 beautiful children. Nikki and Doug were still learning to live with one another. It was definitely a life changer.
As Nikki's boyfriend, Doug is a leading suspect in her murder. He is brought to the sheriff's office for a formal interview and informed that the body police have found is most likely Nikki.
This body that was found down the street, there's a lot of similarities.
Doug was crying, emotional, in a state of shock.
With Nikki identified as the victim, detectives asked Doug to recount the events leading up to the last time he saw her alive.
Doug reported that they had been out at a concert at the Watering Hole, which is a bar in a suburb of Green Bay.
As the night progressed, they had been consuming alcohol, and Doug had ran into some friends from high school that he had not seen in a while. And he confirmed that Nikki was mad because she saw Doug talking to another female at the Watering Hole, and this basically set her off.
From there, they got separated. He stayed at the Watering Hole with his friend Greg, and Nikki went with their friend group to the Sardine Can, which is downtown Green Bay.
Doug had last actually seen Nikki around 11:30 when she departed from the Watering Hole to the Sardine Can.
At some point, Nikki did get a hold of Doug on the phone.
What did she say?
Who are you talking to? She was hysterical, drunk, and irrational. Not making any sense.
Detectives ask if they can search Doug's phone for any texts he'd exchanged with Nikki.
Nikki was definitely angry texting Doug. She made mention of what bitch are you talking to? She was accusing him of cheating, telling him that he was abusive. It was actually a really big red flag for me.
Had Doug and Nikki's argument escalated into violence later that night?
It started to kind of click with everybody that they had an argument, something happened, it went too far, and Doug may be involved.
Coming up, detectives learn more about the night of the murder.
When we look at the video footage, you can see a male follower out of the gate.
We are trying to figure out what exactly happened a short distance away out of camera view.
She's not wanting to have anything to do with him and starts turning into an argument and becomes a little bit physical.
And uncover surprising new suspects.
I'm going to tell you that your timeline seems so abundantly rehearsed. The time to be honest with us is right now.
Before a stunning twist throws the case into turmoil.
The true killer came completely out of left field.
The Google dashboard data showed him at every single crime scene that we had.
I was very concerned who this could be. Who did this to our beloved Nikki?
After confirming that the body discovered in a farm field is 31-year-old mother of 3, Nikki Vanderheiden, police suspect that her violent murder may be linked to an angry exchange of texts she had with her boyfriend Doug Dietrich the night she was killed.
The text messages definitely led us to believe that if Nikki would have made it home and if she would have had contact with Doug, there would have been some sort of altercation.
When detectives pressed Doug about what happened that night, he claims that after 12:30 a.m., he and his friend Greg left the bar they'd been at to look for Nikki at another bar.
Doug describes getting the sardine can with Greg, finding that Nikki's not there, and then continuing to look around for her and being concerned.
Doug stated that he had assumed that Nikki made it home and that she would be there when he got there. So him and Greg got in their car and drove home.
With Nikki's 2 older children away for the night with their father, Doug says he got home to find the babysitter and his son, but no Nikki.
She said we haven't heard from Nikki, and I was just kind of figuring wherever she went, with a friend or whatever. And that's why I went to bed.
She did not come home at all last night after you.
Not at all. There wasn't a blip or word from her.
He said that he woke up to give the baby a bottle at 6:30 in the morning, and Nikki wasn't there.
And it did not appear that Mr. Dietrich was all that concerned until later in the day, which drew our suspicions.
I did have concern as to why did it take until about 4:30 the next day to report her missing.
Following their interview with Doug, investigators obtain a sample of his DNA and release him.
The initial interview with Doug was basically to get him locked in so that we could corroborate everything that he was telling us through either physical evidence or through other statements from other witnesses.
As police set out to verify Doug's story, Nikki's family and friends learned that she's been murdered.
Knowing that Nikki was murdered and how horrific it was impacted our lives in a very horrible way. Who the hell would do this to someone with such an amazing, beautiful soul?
Reports of Nikki's murder spread shock through the community, and Nikki's family members share their grief on local news.
Heather Meyer and her family say it doesn't seem real.
Terrible. Absolutely terrible. She's been extremely up and down, numbing pain.
As Nikki's loved ones continue reeling from her death, an officer from the sheriff's office makes a crucial find.
An officer located some clothing on the side of the road, approximately a mile drive from where Nikki's body was located. Deputies were able to identify the clothing as Nikki's.
There was blood located at numerous areas in the clothing. The majority of the blood was in her pants area.
There was also a purse located which contained her ID. Her cell phone was also found at that same location. It was pretty apparent that it just got tossed out the window in a panic just by the suspect wanting to get rid of it.
As they submit Nikki's items to the lab for testing, detectives receive her autopsy report.
The primary injuries were the strangulation and trauma to the head.
They had discovered over 240 injuries to Nikki's body, including 30 to her head and face area. The last few minutes of Nikki's life would have been very painful.
There were injuries to her genitalia, which could be indicative of a sexual assault. The medical examiners did do a sexual assault exam, which included swabbing for evidence. The lab started finding a partial male profile, but they didn't have enough information to get an identification of it.
The crime lab advised us that we would need to continue to submit samples that the suspect would have touched. We're only allowed to send in so many exhibits at a time as the crime lab is very busy. We have hundreds of swabbings of Nikki's clothing, so I started off with areas where you would more likely see some touch DNA.
While they await answers from the crime lab, detectives get a hold of security video to learn what they can about Nikki's last hours.
When we first were able to take a look at the video footage from the sardine can, we were able to identify Nikki there with Doug's friends. Initially, she appeared to be having a good time, dancing around.
The later portion of the evening, we can see Nikki and her group of friends at an outside table, and you can see Nikki looking down at her phone. You can tell by her body movements that she is upset.
And eventually, she gets up and storms off through an entrance that they're sitting nearby.
What detectives see next catches their attention.
After Nikki leaves, you can see a male follow her out of the gate.
Police ask themselves, who was this man? And was he involved in Nikki's murder?
We knew that his information was going to be vital. That was the last time Nikki was seen before she was killed.
We wanted to know everything that he saw and heard because he's the last known person that we knew that saw her alive.
The day after Nikki Vanderheiden is found murdered in a farmer's field, investigators are trying to track down the man seen following her out of a bar just hours before she was killed.
In the video, there is a male party following after Nikki and walking off into the darkness. We are trying to figure out what exactly happened a short distance away out of camera view.
Officers are dispatched to interview patrons who were at the bar that night.
Based on the interviews with witnesses, we knew that male was Aaron Kolinsky.
This was a friend that they were with earlier in the night.
Police track Aaron down and bring him in for an interview.
Aaron advised us that throughout most of the night, Nikki was having a great time. And then at some point, he saw a mood shift in her. He basically had said that Nikki was trying to get a hold of Doug and that he wasn't responding.
Nikki ultimately became very angry, and that's when she left the sardine can on foot. Aaron describes following her and trying to convince her to come back and get a taxi or an Uber to go back home.
What Aaron says happened next raises detective suspicion.
But she's not wanting to have anything to do with him, and it starts turning into an argument and becomes a little bit physical.
At one point, Nikki fell to the ground on her own, and she started creating a bigger scene. Aaron advised us that she began kicking and punching at him as he was trying to help her up. He had tried to tell her, hey, we can get you home, you can come with us, but she refused.
Aaron noticed that there were people in the neighborhood seeing what was going on, so he decided to just leave it alone at that point.
Investigators wonder if there's more to the story than Aaron's telling them.
We were actually able to find those people, and they indeed remembered a female and male yelling or having a disagreement.
Continuing to watch the video, Aaron does return a very short time later, and based on the other statements from the friends that were with the group, we knew that Aaron didn't necessarily do anything wrong.
Aaron says he and his friends took an Uber home, never to see Nikki alive again.
There was video footage that showed Aaron and the other group leaving in an Uber, and there was no indication that they had come back to the area after they left.
With Aaron crossed off the list, police continue scouring the bar's security video for clues and find something unexpected.
We eventually saw Doug and Greg arrive there. Doug told us they're looking all over for Nikki, but the video is showing that he and Greg go to the bar and just start hanging out. It definitely isn't consistent with the sense of concern that he was initially talking about.
According to the surveillance video, Doug and Greg stayed at that sardine can until about 2:15 in the morning. And the fact that Doug said that they did all this looking while at the sardine can told us that he's not being entirely truthful with his efforts to locate her.
Detectives wonder if Doug had misled them about his concern for Nikki. Was there something he was hiding?
Just the mere fact that he didn't know where his girlfriend was and didn't appear to care all that much was a red flag.
With their suspicion growing, police reach out to Nikki's family to learn more about her relationship with Doug.
Nikki's mother and sister, they both voice concerns of Doug's behavior.
I know, it's been really, really rocky during her pregnancy and their relationship. Crazy relationship. He's always been very controlling. I get Dad's serious. Get pretty good. Yeah.
Nikki's mom, as well as her sister, Heather, both say that they wouldn't be surprised if Doug was the person that was responsible for this.
Investigators search Doug's name in police records and make an alarming discovery.
Checking police records, we did locate past girlfriends that accused him of being abusive. There was at least one incident that was reported to police, but was never charged.
Police contact the woman who filed a complaint against Doug and ask her for more details.
When you would argue, it would be...
He would spit in my face.
Okay.
He would, throw stuff, break stuff. He was really controlling. He was really manipulative.
So when we saw that, that was obviously very concerning to us.
He tackled me and broke my ankle.
Despite learning that Doug's ex-girlfriend had a prior assault conviction and that Doug had never been formally charged for domestic violence, investigators remain suspicious.
At this point, we had the information that showed there could be the pattern of this abusive, aggressive behavior. And we know that Doug and Nicole had a volatile relationship, which would lead us to believe that there would be some sort of confrontation that night.
Police obtain a warrant to search Doug and Nicole's home.
During the search at Doug and Nikki's house, there were several things of concern that were located. There was blood on the floor in the garage. There was blood and dirt found in Nikki's vehicle.
There was also a set of Nike Air Jordan shoes that had a herringbone pattern on them, which was similar to what was on Nikki's back. There was also some red marks on the surface, appeared to be blood on the bottom of those shoes.
While conducting the search, Doug's neighbors from across the street approached police with a startling new discovery.
While mowing their lawn, they noticed a blood spot on the curb line of their property, and also they hit a cord of some type with their lawnmower.
We did find a large quantity of what appeared to be dried blood, as well as 2 pieces of electrical phone charging cord. There was also some clumps of blonde hair.
The blood on those items and the blood found in the road were positively identified as Nikki's. It was pretty apparent to us that that's where the altercation took place. That's where she was likely killed. When that crime scene in front of the house was located, that gave us a theory of what happened, and it continued to point us towards Doug as a suspect.
After determining that Nikki Vanderheiden was likely murdered on the street in front of the home she shared with Doug Dietrich, investigators are weighing a growing body of evidence against Doug.
This evidence that we found is kind of emboldening what we had initially thought, that Nikki got home, an argument ensued between her and Doug, and this incident took place in the street, and somehow some of that evidence would have gotten transformed into the garage and then into Nikki's vehicle.
Looking at the totality of the circumstances, we decided there was probable cause to arrest Doug at that point.
Okay. Right now I'm going to be taking you into custody. We'll be handcuffing you. I'll explain all that to you in a bit. And transporting you down to the sheriff's department. Okay? Okay. Be cooperative with me. All right.
With Doug in custody, detectives work to solidify their case against him.
When we did the search of Nikki's car and found the blood and the dirt in the car, it was initially thought that that may have been the vehicle that was used to take Nikki to the field where she was located.
One of the things that we learned was that she had a progressive snapshot device in her vehicle, which is used for driving behavior, insurance rates. But we figured that this could help us show location from the night she was murdered.
Once we got those records back, it was found that her vehicle did not move the night of her murder. At that point, all kinds of questions are still out there. The big one being if Doug was involved in this, how Doug may have moved her. Did he use a different vehicle? Did he have help?
We knew that Doug's vehicle was not in play. It was at the watering hole all night, where it was verified on video.
One person whose name came up was Greg Matthew, who was actually driving Doug during their night out and dropped Doug off at home.
Greg was Doug's best friend, was with Doug that entire night, and we were focused on him maybe being an accessory.
Investigators bring Greg to the sheriff's office and ask him about the night of the murder.
Greg was very exact about timelines of phone calls and what they did that night.
12:15, got in my car, Nikki was calling him, yelling at him, telling him she's leaving. By the time we get back to the sardine can, all of our friends left. At what point we left, it was probably 2:15. Got to Doug's house probably at 2:45 and went back to my house. My parents were home. They know that I was there the rest of that night.
Greg's timeline was very consistent with Doug's, which was suspicious in nature that you usually aren't going to have your times down that path.
I'm going to tell you that your timeline seems so abundantly rehearsed, so that the time to be honest with us is right now.
We pressed Greg very hard, hoping that we would find some sort of inconsistencies in his story or get him to crack and finally turn on Doug.
Honestly, I had absolutely nothing to do with what? What did you have nothing to do with? Anything to do with. What did you have nothing to do with? So I would like to leave.
After becoming upset with some questions, he did leave while investigators were still sitting at the interview table talking to him.
Investigators asked Greg's parents to confirm his alibi of coming straight home from Doug's shortly after 2:45 a.m.
Greg's parents told us they were only going off of what he told them. They didn't physically see him or have any firsthand knowledge.
While detectives keep Greg on the board as a potential accomplice to Doug, they receive DNA test results from the crime scene.
There was little to no sign of Doug's DNA anywhere on Nicole's body or clothing.
Doug's DNA profile is not matching up with an unknown male DNA profile that we're finding on those items.
Test results on other evidence bring even more disappointing news for investigators.
It turns out the blood on the floor of the garage was likely from a turkey that Doug had killed while hunting. The blood in Nikki's car was from one of her other children, and it was not Nikki's.
What we thought was blood on the bottom of the shoe tested inconclusive for blood.
So all those things that we thought we believed to be Nikki's blood turned out not to be. We also got location data from Doug and Greg's cell phones that corroborated their account of where they were that night, down to the times they left the bar, the route they took home, then when they got back to Doug's house, and from there.
With no concrete evidence linking Doug to Nikki's murder, authorities release him from jail.
Doug's DNA isn't really showing up where we thought it was going to be, and there's still this unknown male profile that really threw a curve at us.
Police believe that Nikki was murdered in front of her own home. But if Doug hadn't killed her, who had?
I was very concerned who this could be, who this monster could have been that did this to our beloved Nikki.
Two days after finding Nikki Vanderheiden savagely murdered, detectives hunting her killer arrested her boyfriend, Doug Dietrich. But when DNA evidence exonerates Doug, detectives turn their focus to one urgent question.
The biggest question we had to answer outside of who did this was, how did she get home? We spent countless hours watching video surveillance of every single known business between Nikki's residence and the sardine can. We had investigators watching highway camera footage, bridge camera footage to see if we could catch either her walking or crossing the river to get to that side of town.
We were running out of leads. It was frustrating at times.
Still hoping for a DNA match to the killer, investigators continue sending the crime lab samples of Nikki's clothing found at the side of the road.
We picked 10 items at a time for testing. We were looking for any items that we believe might contain more of this unknown male's DNA, hoping for a full profile. After sending several batches and not coming up with anything definitive, we ended up sending a batch that included the socks that Nikki was wearing still when her body was found.
The crime lab were able to get enough of a profile off of that sock to be able to enter it into the CODIS system.
The suspect somehow got some touch DNA on those socks.
Entered into the National DNA Database, the profile returns a hit that takes investigators by surprise.
The DNA hit that we received was that of George Stephen Birch, who was from the state of Virginia.
As far as we knew, he had no relation to anybody that was with Nikki that night or Nikki herself. All the information we had was leading us towards Doug. So once we got that DNA information, it was very surprising.
George Birch was in and out of prison on the East Coast, and at some point earlier in 2016 had moved to the Green Bay area.
So we start digging through the Green Bay Police Department records, see what we can find out about him.
George Stephen Birch was contacted by the Green Bay Police Department a few weeks after the homicide for a hit-and-run car accident. The vehicle was a Chevy S10 Blazer that was found a short distance away from where Mr. Birch was staying.
At the time, he was questioned about it and claimed that the vehicle must have been stolen.
Suspicious about the nature and timing of the supposed theft, investigators see if his Chevy Blazer could have been used to dump Nikki's body.
We ended up comparing the specs of a Chevy Blazer and the width of the tire tracks that we found in the field, and we found it to be a very near match.
Digging deeper, detectives find even more evidence connecting George to Nikki's last known movements.
We knew that he hung out at a bar that was down in that same general area of the sardine can.
We were able to identify Birch's Google account and track the location of the cell phone that Google account is associated with.
The Google dashboard data showed us road map of Mr. Birch's whereabouts that night, and he was found at every single crime scene that we had, including the farm field, Nicole and Doug's residence, the roadway where Nicole's property was found, and then back at his residence.
When we got that information, we knew we had our guy at that point.
Police track down George Birch and bring him into the sheriff's office.
When we had our contact with Mr. Birch, it was obvious that this wasn't his first contact with law enforcement. He's very cool, very calm. The reason you're here is in reference to a homicide investigation into Nicole Vanderheiden. Okay? So, is this something that you want to talk to me about?
Sir?
What's that?
For a lawyer.
Okay.
Birch didn't provide any details or provide his version of events of anything. We still didn't necessarily have the details on how they met, why they were together.
But with DNA and other evidence firmly implicating him, police charged George Birch with Nikki's murder.
When the suspect was arrested, it was a result of actual physical evidence, and I felt so much relief that the family would never have doubt as to who did this to Nikki.
When the news came out about who did this, he made me sick when I saw him. He looked like a monster.
On February 19th, 2018, George Birch goes on trial for the murder of Nikki Vanderheiden. But when he finally takes the stand, what he says leaves the courtroom stunned.
At trial, Mr. Birch's explanation for what happened was he met Nikki at the bar. They were getting along, flirting, having a good time, and he ended up bringing her back to her house where she resides with Mr. Dietrich.
George said they were having sex in front of Nikki's house in his vehicle, and at some point someone comes out, hits him over the head with a pistol and knocks him unconscious.
The next thing that I remember was literally waking up on the ground outside the truck.
He wakes up and finds Nikki already dead on the ground and someone holding him at gunpoint.
At that point, did you know who that individual was?
Never seen him before in my life.
Do you know who that individual is now?
Now I do.
Who was it?
It was that Petrie.
Investigators believe that 31-year-old Nikki Vanderheiden was brutally murdered by convicted felon George Birch. But at trial, George blindsides everyone by claiming that Doug Dietrich was the one responsible for Nikki's death.
Mr. Birch in the courtroom was very arrogant, very pompous. His demeanor was that of, I'm innocent and Doug did this.
Mr. Birch advised us that Doug ordered George to drive the body to the farm field. George said that Doug had ordered him to carry Nikki's body into the field and drop it. George then said that at one point he was able to get into a struggle with Doug, push him away, and get back into the car and take off.
He didn't come up with that story until he had a chance to look at all the evidence that was being filed against him.
George's wild allegation forces detectives to dig deeper to prove his guilt.
Part of the obstacles in this was disproving that Doug did it and show his movements from that morning and that night.
During the investigation, we learned that Nikki had given Doug a Fitbit device as a gift. So we realized that Doug was wearing that Fitbit device during all our contact with him. So we're able to review the information on the Fitbit device when he was home, going to sleep, and waking up again.
Based upon all the Google dashboard data that we had from George, we knew at what time he and Nikki arrived back to Doug and Nicole's residence. So we were able to look at Doug's Fitbit to show that at that time that George and Nicole were outside, Doug was sleeping and not, in fact, out murdering his girlfriend and disposing of the body.
Back in court, prosecutors used the location tracking evidence to demolish George's story.
The act of violence that Doug allegedly did to him did not add up with any of the other evidence that we had.
None of us bought George's story in court. We all knew it was a joke and a fairy tale made up. I think Nikki just wanted to get home to her children, and I know she fought for her life that night.
Now prosecutors put forth their theory of what really happened that night.
What I believe happened is that there was some arguments between Doug and Nikki.
I believe that Nikki did leave the sardine can pretty upset and ended up at Richard Cranium's bar, about a half a mile away.
She was intoxicated. She was by herself. She was emotional. She is very outgoing, personable person. So she'd be very easy for someone to prey upon.
At some point, she meets George Birch. They get to talking. He offers Nikki a ride home. She accepts it. They end up in front of her house. I believe at that point, George thought he was going to get some action for taking a girl home and didn't expect her to start fighting.
And that enraged Mr. Birch.
It turns into a sexual assault. At some point, he strangles her with that phone cord that was found.
She fell out of the vehicle. He continued to stomp on her back and her head, eventually killing her. And then loading her up in his vehicle, driving her to a field and disposing of her body, and then going home like nothing happened.
This poor woman was absolutely brutally attacked and murdered in front of her own home where her baby lay sleeping, and the thought of what he did to her is beyond comprehension.
After closing arguments, it didn't take very long at all for them to make a decision.
The verdict reads as follows. We, the jury, find the defendant, George Stephen Birch, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide.
For murdering Nikki Vander Heiden, George Birch is sentenced to life in prison without parole.
The true killer in this homicide came completely out of left field. I felt extreme relief for the family that someone was going to answer for this extremely heinous, horrific crime.
He's going to prison for the rest of his life. That was music to our ears, but we still knew it wasn't going to bring our Nikki back.
Nikki had 3 young children at home, one of which is a newborn. She had her entire life ahead of her and a lot of things to accomplish and a lot of friends and family that miss her.
She was an incredible human being, a great mother, and she should be recognized as that.
Despite the pain of Nikki's loss, her friends and loved ones are devoted to keeping her memory alive.
My children and I, we celebrate her life every year on May 21st, and we talk about her, and we go to the cemetery. I love to remember Nikki dancing and smiling and laughing. I loved her laugh. It was so contagious. She was always smiling. I love to remember her that way.
A vibrant and loving young mother.
She was just an awesome person. She had a little feisty side to her because of the redhead, but she was always looking out for everybody else.
Is found savagely murdered inside an office building washroom.
There was insulated electrical wire used to strangle her.
It appeared that there had been a sexual assault.
Detectives pursue multiple suspects.
There were problems with the marriage. They had had issues. They had been arguing.
He was in the building the night she was killed. His prints matched the prints inside the bathroom stall.
And hunt down an elusive killer.
We talked to the attorney who states that he is probably somewhere in South America.
I said, okay, where's he at? Can we get him?
That no one could have imagined.
I was in shock. I couldn't believe it.
It was very unexpected to see him as the actual killer.
Known for its live music scene, Austin, Texas is also one of the safest big cities in the country.
Austin's kind of one of those cool vibe cities, and it's just a very good mix of people.
There's a lot of green belts and parks and creeks and trails. It's a really neat place to live. Austin has not had the kind of crime and the volume of crime as other large cities. People do typically feel safe.
But in 1983, the town is rocked when a local businessman makes a gruesome discovery.
In the early morning hours of September 20th, 1983, the Austin Police Department received a 911 call. One of the tenants of an office complex had come in the morning and discovered things were out of place. There was a cleaning cart out in the hallway, so he went to try to find out if anyone else was still in the building. He did discover a deceased female in the upstairs men's restroom.
The 911 caller did not know her name, but he recognized her as the woman who did clean the building.
Police are dispatched to the scene.
When we located the female victim in the men's restroom, she was positioned inside of the stall.
She was undressed. There was insulated electrical wire that had small loops tied on the ends of them. Detectives believed that electrical wire was used to strangle her and be the cause of her death. It appeared, because she had no defensive wounds at all, that the killer came up from behind and surprised her.
Everything in the crime scene suggested that this was a violent attack.
There was wet toilet paper inside of her nose and her mouth. It stands to reason the killer put that in her mouth and her nose after he strangled her. to ensure that she was good and dead.
There was a bodily fluid and a clothing that made it appear as if she was drug across the floor. Her clothes were scattered amongst the restroom, and it appeared that there had been a sexual assault. The victim was identified by an ID that was found inside of her purse. She was Lori Stout, a 22-year-old female from Austin.
While forensics collect samples, investigators look for other evidence left behind by the killer.
A significant fingerprint was located in the men's stall of the restroom.
When dragging her in there, the person would almost have to brace themselves on the wall of the inside of the stall. The print inside the bathroom stall matched a print on the second floor fire escape. So the two of those were pretty significant.
Had the killer fled through the fire escape after committing the murder? Detectives head down to the parking lot looking for more clues.
They found that there was a spool that was used for insulated electrical wiring inside the dumpster. They also found some looser pieces of the same type of wiring that was used to kill the victim.
Detectives bag the items for analysis. Back inside, police start piecing together a theory of who could have committed this horrible act.
The fact that the victim was killed inside the building in the middle of the night suggested that whoever did this had access or a key to get in it.
Detectives canvassed the building and talked to employees, but determined that no one had seen anything suspicious.
We were able to talk with two witnesses that saw Lori at about 12:30 a.m. as they locked up and secured the building and left.
We know that she was last seen alive around 12:30 in the morning, and the employee at the building discovered her body around 8 a.m. So she died sometime during that time frame.
Just as investigators are finishing up, a frantic man arrives at the scene. He identifies himself as Gary Stout and demands to know where his wife Lori is.
Gary Stout told detectives he woke up that morning and discovered that his wife was not home yet from work. He got worried and he drove up to the building, which was a short distance away, and discovered her car still in the parking lot, but it was surrounded by numerous police cars. It was at that point that the police spoke with him and broke the news that his wife was found dead.
He was obviously traumatized by what had happened.
As police take Gary down to the station for questioning, the devastating news soon spreads to the rest of Lori's family.
I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. My whole world changed. I no longer had my confidant, no longer had my best friend. It was horrible, horrible.
When we found out that Lori had been killed, it was a big impact. It was overwhelming.
Born in Arlington, Virginia in 1960, Lori Coffey was a naturally warm and caring soul.
Lori was the oldest of Lori, myself, and TJ, but she was kind of the mother hen of us all. She had a little feisty side to her, and I think maybe because of the redhead, but she was always looking out for everybody else. She was just an awesome person. She really, truly was.
Lori was the leader of us three musketeers, me, Beverly, and Lori. And she kept us going.
After moving to Austin with her mother and siblings, in 1977, Lori met Gary Stout, who worked logistics for the military.
It all flourished very fast. She was so giddy about Gary, and they fell in love. All in all, he just seemed like a good guy, so we were all, okay, so this is it.
After a whirlwind courtship, Lori and Gary married the following year. 3 years later, Lori became pregnant.
She was over the moon, very, very happy. I mean, that's what she wanted. She wanted to be married, start having a family, and she was on her way.
But Lori is soon forced to face the harsh realities of military family life.
Gary got orders to go to Belgium. She was very sad. Lori was sad that Gary was gone overseas, and here she was facing having a baby on her own at home.
On January 26, 1982, while Gary is away, Lori gives birth to a baby girl.
Lori had a really easy labor, and, now we have this little baby, and, of course, she was ecstatic.
I think that she very much enjoyed being a mother. I think that she experienced probably the happiest months of her life after I was born.
In order to spend more time with his family, Gary left the military and took a job as a maintenance worker in the same building where Lori worked nights as a cleaner.
She was very excited that he was coming home. That's all she wanted, just to be a mom and wife, homemaker.
With her life finally on track, how did this loving young mother become the victim of a cold-blooded killer?
As with any investigation, you have to look at those that are closest to the victim and those that have motive. As an employee of the building, a maintenance worker there, Gary had access.
Down at the station, police questioned Gary about his marriage to Lori.
When we asked him about any problems in their relationship, he quickly admitted that they had had issues, they had been arguing, and were unhappy.
Detectives discovered that Lori actually went and stayed with her sister, Beverly, shortly before the murder happened because of a really big argument that she had with Gary.
Things were not going all that well for her and Gary, and she was miserable.
This definitely created a concern that there were problems with the marriage. So knowing that he has access and motive, it raises the level of suspicion that he could have been involved in this crime.
Coming up, detectives uncover disturbing secrets.
He wasn't happy in his relationship, and he admitted that he was looking at leaving her.
Lori's family felt very strongly that he was the killer.
Before a shocking tip takes police in a whole new direction.
We received information from a female victim of a man that committed a similar attack against her.
This is a big turning point in the investigation.
Could this be a serial rapist? Could it be a serial murder?
And has detectives risking it all to catch a killer.
We knew it was going to have to be something big for us to find him.
We were holding our breath. We weren't sure it was going to happen.
Police investigating the murder of 22-year-old mother Lori Stout are questioning their first suspect, her husband Gary.
When Gary was being interviewed, he was very forthcoming about the poor state of his marriage with Lori. So it was a little bit of a red flag.
At this point in the investigation, we need additional information about problems that may be in their relationship.
Lori and Gary were happy. When they first got married, she was proud to be a wife. That's all she wanted.
But things changed when Gary returned from overseas.
Lori wanted it to just be like it was before he left, and unfortunately that was not the case.
So knowing the family's account of their relationship as well, knowing that it was a volatile relationship, that created concern that he could have been frustrated with Lori and committed this type of act.
When detectives press Gary for details about why his marriage was falling apart, he makes an alarming confession.
He admitted that he had actually had an affair and was looking at leaving Lori.
Gary tells detectives that he met a woman while overseas and that she had since come to visit him in Austin.
At this point, the detectives are wondering, does Gary want Lori out of the picture given the very bad state of their marriage and the fact that he wants to be with this woman he's having an affair with?
Gary explains that he ultimately chose to stay with Lori, but detectives become even more suspicious after they ask him for an alibi.
He stated that the night before, he and Lori had an argument, so she went and slept on the couch. At one point, she finally just got up in the early morning hours, went to work. Gary did not have an alibi that we could confirm. He was at home with a young child, asleep. He could have left his house, gone up to the building, and come back. That would not be something we could verify.
So the marital difficulties, and now we've got a big fight, and Gary having access to the building. He's somebody that they're looking at pretty hard.
Detectives asked Gary to provide samples of his blood and fingerprints to be compared with evidence found at the crime scene.
He was cooperative with us. He provided samples that were requested.
Looking further into Gary's movements leading up to the murder, investigators reach out to his boss at the office building.
The manager of the building informed the detectives that Gary had fixed a water heater the day before Lori was killed. And he used the same type of electrical wiring that was used to kill Lori.
This was another extremely big flag in the case. All these things together really raised the suspicion that this is the guy.
As police wait for forensic testing results, Lori's autopsy report comes in.
Lori's cause of death was in fact strangulation, and that seemed to match the ligature found at the scene.
What was determined is that a sexual assault had taken place.
They were able to get a sample of semen. However, this is 1983, so there was no DNA testing available. In order to do any comparison, we used blood type antigens. This kind of evidence is helpful in narrowing down the field of suspects.
When we found out how Lori was actually killed, it was disturbing. First thought to my mind, one sick individual. One very sick individual that did it.
Pure evil. Absolute pure evil.
Detectives eagerly receive the results of Gary's fingerprints and blood tests, but they are far from conclusive.
Gary's fingerprints did not match the one inside the stall, but did match prints in the building. But he has access to the building and he is working there. His blood type, it matches the type found in the semen. But of course, Gary is married to Lori, so it's another piece of evidence that can go both ways.
Ultimately, we couldn't use fingerprints or any blood work to exclude him.
Running out of options, detectives try one last method to get to the truth.
Gary Stout was provided an opportunity to take a polygraph. During that interview, he was asked if he was responsible for the murder of Lori, and he advised he wasn't. The results of that polygraph indicated that he was being truthful and there was no deception.
Detectives were surprised that Gary passed the polygraph. Now, detectives have motive, they have access, but no evidence conclusively to show that Gary is in fact the killer.
With nothing to hold him on, Gary is free to go.
At this point, Gary is not ruled out as a suspect, but he takes a little bit more of a backseat.
Looking for new leads, investigators turn their focus back to the numerous employees who work at the building where Lori was killed.
What's difficult, particularly about a public space like this, is so many people have access. We talked to everybody that was a tenant in that building and started working our way through that process. Many of those folks were excluded based on fingerprints, evidence, everything else that could really put them to the side.
But police learned that the building's tenants weren't the only ones who had access that night.
We discovered that registration was being conducted from the University of Texas' satellite location at this office complex. And they stayed late after hours so that folks could come after work, sign up late into the evening. So this was definitely something of interest for us.
Detectives were able to get the names of the male students who had gone in that night, and they had them come down to the police department and they got fingerprints of these individuals.
Police processed the fingerprints of over a dozen students and receive an alarming result.
We were able to rule everyone out on the list with the exception of one. We had a fingerprint inside the men's restroom as well as a fire escape door. So this person is somebody we want to talk to and interview.
Detectives investigating the brutal murder of Lori Stout have just matched a set of crime scene fingerprints with someone who was in the building that night.
The University of Texas was having a sign-up registration at the satellite campus, which allowed people to come after hours in the evenings after work in order to get signed up for classes. So we start going through the list of registrants.
Detectives were able to determine that there was one student whose prints matched the prints inside the bathroom stall where Lori was found, and also on the fire escape door on that second floor.
That individual was identified as Robert Van Weese, and he was 18 years old.
Investigators interview Robert about his movements on the night Lori was killed.
He told us that he had been there for registration, and on his way out, he used the men's restroom upstairs. Once he was done in the restroom, he exited the fire escape because it was closer to where his vehicle was parked, and which would explain why his fingerprints were found in the men's stall and the fire escape door.
Robert Van Weese did acknowledge that he saw the cleaning lady, which was our victim, Lori, after using the bathroom on the second floor before he exited the building.
Robert tells detectives that he left the building at around 12:15 a.m. Before investigators look to verify his story, they ask Robert for a blood sample to compare to the semen found at the crime scene.
Robert Van Weese was cooperative. He gave the blood sample at the time, and the detectives submitted it for testing.
There is nothing that we discover on Robert Van Weese's criminal history or anything else that causes concern. It appears he's had no contact with law enforcement and no violent offenses in the past.
He came from a family that is very well respected. His parents are pretty well-known surgeons in the Austin area. There didn't seem to be anything that would suggest him to behave in this kind of violent way.
While they wait for the results, detectives look for anyone who can corroborate Robert's story.
Detectives interviewed 2 employees of the education office, and they confirmed that they saw Robert Van Weese leave the building at 12:15. We know Lori was still alive because there were witnesses that confirmed she was alive at 12:30.
With Robert looking less and less like a viable suspect, his blood test results come in.
The analysis of the blood sample told us that Robert was not a match to the bodily fluids found at the crime scene.
The discovery means there is no hard evidence against Robert, and they are forced to let him go.
Robert Van Weese was ruled out and eliminated as a suspect.
With no new leads, the investigation falters. As weeks pass with no arrests, fear in the community grows.
The nature of the crime had created a lot of panic for residents, particularly females. It was difficult because there was no resolution.
It left a lot of fear in the community. The police felt pressure to find out who was responsible for Lori's death. I mean, this was a totally innocent mother, 22 years old, taken from her family in a very violent attack.
The people in and around that area where she was killed, they were interested in knowing what was going on. It was tough on our family. It is very frustrating. There's somebody out there that has taken a life, and you want that person to be held accountable.
Anytime there's a crime committed like this, there's an inherent pressure to solve it, to try to bring some closure and some comfort to the family and to the community.
A person that could do something like this, that's not somebody that's going to stop at that one act. Typically speaking, that person is going to continue to hurt other people.
We're always worried that, he can continue to commit these kind of acts until he's brought to justice.
1 month after Lori's murder, police receive a promising new lead.
We received information from a female victim of a man that committed a similar attack against her. The victim was sexually assaulted and strangled, but she was able to get away.
He mistakenly thought she was dead, and she was able to identify him. That person's name was Daryl Kemp. Daryl Kemp at that point was in prison, but he was not in prison at the time that Lori was killed.
And so we started looking into this. We evaluated the information and started to determine if this could potentially be a suspect in this case.
Police dig into Daryl Kemp's background and discover a disturbing pattern.
It's determined that Daryl Kemp committed an attack in 1960, similar, where the victim was sexually assaulted and strangled.
He was convicted for the rape and murder of a woman named Marjorie Hipperson in California. He did receive the death penalty for that. But later on, that death penalty got overturned.
Ultimately, he was released and paroled in 1978. That's when Daryl Kemp moved to Austin.
His MO matched. He's killed in this fashion before, and he was in Austin at the time. So this is going to be somebody that detectives look at pretty intently.
Could this be a serial rapist? Could it be a serial murder? We had questions that we needed to get answers to.
One month after young mother Lori Stout was found raped and murdered in a bathroom stall, police are investigating a tip that she was the victim of convicted serial killer Daryl Kemp.
Detectives at this time were thinking that Daryl Kemp was a strong possibility as a suspect because of the similar MO, which was sexual assault and strangulation.
Investigators learned that although Daryl is currently in jail for an unrelated crime, he was a free man at the time Lori was killed. Detectives head to prison to question him.
The difficult part about interviewing somebody like Daryl Kemp is he's obviously been down this road before. He's got knowledge of how investigations work, and so information may be withheld or may not be genuine in his responses based on where he thinks or feels like your questions are leading him.
Detectives start by questioning Daryl about where he was around the time of Lori's murder.
They're asking him questions that would help tie him or connect him to the area that the building was located in. They asked if he knew where this building was, where he lived, basically to try to put him in a geographical area, figure out where he frequented.
Daryl tells investigators he wasn't near the office building where Lori was killed and has no ties to the area.
Daryl Kemp was asked if he was familiar with Lori Stout. He said he wasn't. Things that we're trying to pay attention to is whether his statements are truthful. Does his body language support his statement? Does it appear he's being deceptive? And is he forthcoming with his answers?
Not trusting the word of a convicted killer, detectives shift gears.
He was asked if he would take a polygraph. He hesitated with that because he didn't trust polygraphs. He is not cooperative at all.
It's the same story when investigators ask him for his fingerprints and a blood sample.
Again, he was very uncooperative.
Based on all the evidence collected, we had enough information to obtain a warrant.
Police collect Daryl's samples and eagerly wait for the results.
When the results of the analysis were returned, it was determined that he was not the suspect in this murder. It's very difficult and frustrating because we're at a stalling point again.
With no other leads, the case once again hits a wall. As the months turn into years, Lori's loved ones struggle with the lack of closure.
Why are we not getting any answers? You know, give us something. I myself have been lost without her.
Every time October 1st rolls around, first thing I think is, oh, it's Lori's birthday. Anytime when September comes around, when she was taken from us, it's not good.
The suspicion that Lori's husband Gary was the killer continues to linger and causes a deep divide.
My mother's family, even members of his own family, believed that my dad was involved.
We all still had that suspicion that Gary had something to do with it.
Eventually, Gary takes Dale and moves out of state.
Gary, he didn't want to have anything else to do with us. So it was like, oh my God, now we can't see Dale. I lost my sister, but I also lost that connection with my niece.
Being so young, she didn't really remember her mom. So it was probably quite hard on Dale.
When I was growing up, there weren't a whole lot of conversations about my mother. It was just the understanding of she wasn't there anymore.
As Dale grows older, she begins to ask questions.
My dad did not like talking about it. I did not have a family member sit me down and explain to me that this is what had happened to her. It wasn't until I got older, got access to the internet, that's when I learned that she was attacked, that she had been strangled, that she had been raped, and then she had been murdered. It was very overwhelming finding out about it in that way.
Lori's family continues to push for her killer to be brought to justice.
We never gave up hope. We tried to keep it fresh and focused on it. We were constantly checking in.
We had to get this case closed to help give our family a little peace. It was overwhelming.
The pressure finally pays off And in 1992, nearly 10 years after Lori's murder, a new team of detectives reopen her case.
Now we have new eyes looking at everything. They look at the crime scene photos. They read all the police reports. They look at the various people that were interviewed.
Part of that process is to go back and look at old evidence. Are there things now that are available to law enforcement that weren't previously available? Is there testing that can be done?
Now we're in 1992, so we have DNA testing, which is much more powerful.
With that in mind, investigators revisit their prime suspect, Lori's husband, Gary Stout.
So Gary was contacted again and provided a DNA sample, which was compared to that obtained at the crime scene.
Police are hopeful that they'll finally have the evidence they need to make an arrest. But when the results come back, they are shocked at what they reveal.
It was determined that Gary was not a match. So officially, he could be ruled out as a suspect and remove the cloud of doubt that had been hanging over his head for some period of time.
I do believe that my father felt relief, but it was very difficult for him to talk about.
With Gary cleared, cold case detectives go back over the old files, line by line.
With any review of a case, you look at who's been interviewed, who's been eliminated, and what was discovered is that one of the reports that was provided as far as the blood typing seemed to have an error.
The documentation that was used to finalize the forensic report that excluded a suspect actually showed that there was a clerical error in that lab report. And that particular suspect should have been included as a suspect, not excluded. This is a big turning point in the investigation.
"10 years after wife and mother Lori Stout was savagely murdered, cold case detectives have unearthed a stunning error in the results of a blood test. That means a previously cleared suspect might not be innocent after all.
What was discovered is that the report said the subject could be eliminated, but there was a clerical error in the document and it should have read that he could not be eliminated.
This suspect is Robert Van Wiese, the 18-year-old University of Texas student. He was in the building the night Lori was killed, registering for a class, and he's the same person whose prints were found inside the bathroom stall and also on the second-floor fire escape door.
Detectives look into what Robert Van Wiese had been doing the last 10 years.
Robert Van Wiese had no criminal history. Here we have this 18-year-old college student coming from a well-to-do family, parents who are professionals, seemed to have a very normal, happy upbringing. He was cooperative. So that all combined with the report that we received, naturally excluded him as a suspect.
Could 18-year-old Robert really have committed such a brutal crime?
In talking with witnesses, Robert Van Wiese is seen about 12:15 a.m. and leaving at about 12:30. They see Lori in the building by herself.
Detectives re-examine the fingerprints he left at the crime scene and notice something troubling.
What they discover is that his story of exiting the building through that second-floor fire escape door would naturally support fingerprints being left on the inside of that door, as if you're pushing it open to leave. But some prints of his are found on the door handle on the exterior of the door, as if you're opening it to enter the building.
What this told us is that he had obviously left the building, but he had also come back in.
He would have been able to re-enter it through that same door if he had propped it open with something.
The discoveries mean investigators need to talk to Robert, but there's a problem.
We try to locate Robert Van Wiese, but we're not able to. We reach out to family members who are not cooperative. They provide an attorney's contact. We talk to the attorney who states that Robert Van Wiese is probably somewhere in South America.
All evidence up to that point showed he was in the Austin area, and then he likely finds out that he, once again, is a suspect, and now we have DNA testing capability. so he flees.
Fearing Robert has left the country, detectives scramble to find him. They interview dozens of his friends and family members, but no one is willing to cooperate. Before they can launch an all-out search, detectives still need more proof that Robert's the killer. So they come up with a plan to obtain his DNA.
With Robert Van Wiese having fled, we cannot get a sample from him, but what we are able to do is get what's called YSTR testing accomplished. And that's familial DNA, and it's specific to the Y chromosome that all brothers and fathers would share. So since Robert Van Wiese has brothers in the Austin area, that's something we can actually test.
In order to obtain the sample, detectives conducted surveillance with family members, and at one point they observed one of the brothers discard trash and retrieve it.
Trash is not something you need to get a search warrant for because it's what's deemed abandoned. So detectives take specific items that would gather DNA evidence, like razor blades and toothpicks, and they conduct YSTR testing.
When the DNA tests come back, the results are conclusive.
And lo and behold, it's a match.
Finally, we're able to make a direct connection with Robert Van Wiese to the DNA found at the crime scene. It was surprising to know that a young male coming from the background that he did had the ability to do this at such a young age.
There were no red flags with him. And so it was very unexpected to see him as the actual killer.
We finally had a name. I just totally broke down. And so you're trying to wrap your head around how could an 18-year-old do something like this?
It was shocking because I was 18 myself at the time. I would have never have had that cross my mind. I said, okay, where is he at? Can we get him? And then that's when we learned that he was gone.
Robert Van Wiese is charged with murder and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, and a warrant is issued for his arrest. Investigators team up with the FBI and launch an international manhunt.
The Van Wiese family owned a lot of properties throughout Mexico. We conducted telephone toll analysis. We looked at financial records. We monitored travel of Van Wiese's family. We did a tremendous amount of ground surveillance on locations where we thought he might be. There were some tips that the FBI received for sightings of Van Wiese in Mexico in certain locations, but we weren't successful in locating him.
Years pass with no sign of Robert, but detectives refuse to quit.
All you want to do is bring the guy back so he can face justice and get some kind of closure for the victims. But even the FBI, we have limited access, limited resources, and Mexico is a big country. There's plenty of places for him to hide.
It is very frustrating because for me, I've lived my entire life waiting for justice, but also very cognizant of the fact that it may never happen.
Then in 2016, the hunt for Robert Van Wiese takes a promising turn.
Van Wiese had been on the run for 20 years, so I knew it was going to have to be something big for us to find him. And so we discussed it, and we said, let's do it. Let's go for it.
On December 13th, 2016, the FBI places Robert Van Wiese on their top 10 most wanted list.
This was huge for our case because it brings awareness, but also that comes with a $100,000 reward. So it was exciting to know that we're making traction.
Once we announced his addition to the FBI's 10 most wanted list, we again interviewed people that knew him and possibly knew where he was. Probably the most important interview was with Van Wiese's mother. We said, Robert is going to be arrested. He is coming home. The safest way is to turn himself in. I think the mother realized with the $100,000 reward, his name on the 10 most wanted list, that it was going to be insurmountable that he was going to get arrested.
The pressure pays off, and a phone call comes in that changes everything.
Robert Van Wiese's attorney contacted the district attorney's office to let them know that he wants to turn himself in.
33 years after the murder of Lori Stout, her elusive killer, Robert Van Wiese, is ready to return to the U.S. to face justice.
Robert Van Wiese's lawyer contacted the district attorney's office and started to inquire about possible surrender with a plea bargain agreement. Typically speaking, when someone is a fugitive, we do not negotiate. But circumstances in this situation are quite unique. Mexico will not agree to extradite to Texas if the death penalty is on the table. So we will not get him in our hands if he's arrested in Mexico unless we agree to not have death penalty on the table.
Wanting a swift resolution, the district attorney negotiates a deal.
Van-Weese would agree to turn himself in, and they agreed to 30 years in prison.
On January 26, 2017, police head to the Mexican border to meet Robert.
The plan was for him to surrender, but we were holding our breath. We weren't sure it was going to happen.
We're anxious that this is finally going to take place, but until we have Robert Van-Weese in physical custody, we can't let our guard down.
The arrangement was that he would meet us at the halfway point on the pedestrian bridge. There's a line in the middle. On one side says Mexico, on the other side says United States. He was to meet us there at 1 o'clock. He didn't show up.
As the minutes tick by, investigators start to worry they've been duped.
We had assurances from the attorney that he would show up, but at any point during that time, he could have turned around and changed his mind, and there was nothing we could have done.
At 1:36 p.m., a lone figure approaches the border.
He walked up very slowly, stopped at the line. He introduced himself as Robert Van-Weese, and I said to him, "You ready to turn yourself in?" He took a deep breath. He closed his eyes. He said, "Yes." I said, "Step on across." And he took one step over, and he was arrested.
Seeing him walk across that bridge and seeing law enforcement put handcuffs on him, it was extremely satisfying.
There'd been so much work from so many different people over the years that from 1983 up until 2017, now we have somebody that's accountable and be brought to justice. It was one of the most rewarding experiences in my career.
I sent the picture to Dale and let her know we got him. And I get a text back that it apparently was Dale's birthday. So it was pretty emotional.
She showed me a photo of Van-Weese being escorted into custody. It's kind of hard to believe that after all of these years that it would be that day of all days that he would turn himself in.
It was, and it still is surreal that it finally did happen. I mean, it just emotions everywhere. I just can't, it's finally over. It's finally over. Finally over.
The plea deal means Robert does not have to speak to investigators, leaving them to piece together how they believe the murder unfolded.
He showed up that night to register for classes. He sees Lori as she's cleaning. It's possible that Robert Van-Weese and Lori Stout had an interaction as he passed her. Maybe she spoke to him. He goes to the bathroom, develops his plan on coming back in.
He's opportunistic, and the opportunity rose, and he left through that fire escape door on the second floor, propped it open.
And once the other workers had all left, I think he came back in.
When he came back in, he would have passed in the parking lot the dumpster that had some leftover electrical wiring that Gary Stout had used that day for the hot water heater, and grabbed it and went upstairs and then attacked her, raped her, and killed her. Lori was killed in probably one of the most personal, violent ways that someone can be killed. Robert Van-Weese is an extremely cold and calculating person.
On March 28, 2017, Robert pleads guilty to Lori's murder and is sentenced to 30 years in prison. Lori's sister, Beverly, is there to deliver an emotional impact statement.
I looked him right in the eye and told him what he had taken from our family and what it had done. And, I just told him I hope he rots in hell and gets to feel some of that terror that my sister felt that night. I know in my heart he is where he needs to be.
I think Lori's family felt a sense of relief, a sense of closure that maybe now At least my hope for them now with that is that they could at least start to heal.
Him being arrested and incarcerated does bring closure. I think that that's what everybody dreams about when a crime like this happens to one of their family members.
Still see Lori's face quite often. She was a hoot. Lori was a hoot. I miss her dearly.
I do believe that my life would have been very different if she would have lived. And I know that she would have done anything to make sure that I had what I needed.
I still think of Lori every day, every single day. There were a lot of good times, good memories with Lori, and I just wish we would have had more.
A trailblazing local businesswoman, beloved by her community.
She was effervescent. She just had a glamour about her that was just unique.
She took pride in who she was.
Savagely murdered in her own home.
This person was so enraged that they just kept stabbing and kept stabbing and kept stabbing.
She had been hit in the head to the point that it actually had changed shape. We're looking for something that's got an edge on it, but that can snap bones.
Detectives uncover a trail of secrets and lies.
He couldn't explain things, and he failed the polygraph miserably.
What kind of animal is this person?
And chase a killer that stays one step ahead of them.
They fled to another country.
Until a series of stunning revelations leaves an entire town in shock.
Everyone was a suspect, and everyone was afraid.
Here comes some guy out of the blue telling us that he's the one who committed the murder.
You would think there's just a serial killer or somebody crazy running around.
I was like, how could we have gotten this wrong?
Two hours southwest of Louisville, Kentucky, lies the quiet town of Madisonville.
Madisonville, Kentucky is a small community. It's built on coal mines and agriculture.
It's a close, tight-knit community.
There's not a lot of crime in our area.
They call themselves the best town on earth, and for the most part, they truly believe that.
On January 13th, 2003, Madisonville police receive a call from an elderly man for a wellness check on his 85-year-old fiancée, Anna Mae Branson.
Her fiancé, Dr. Bob Fenneman, was afraid that she may have fallen or that she had had a stroke of some type.
He knocked on the door and couldn't get her to answer, and that's when he became worried. And he called Anna Mae's brother and the local police department.
An officer meets Anne's fiancé and brother outside her house. Finding a backup key under a bush, they enter the home to look for her.
The patrol officer went in one direction. Dr. Bob Fenneman was just looking around, and Earl Winstead, her brother, went down to the basement. When he got to the bottom of the basement steps, he said, "I found her." It appeared at first that she could have fallen. But then upon seeing all the injuries to her body, it was obvious that Miss Branson had been murdered.
Homicide investigators are called to the scene and are shocked when they arrive.
Miss Ann was a friend of my mother's, and it was quite devastating. She was on her stomach. Her legs were extended. She had many, many stab wounds to her back.
She had been hit in the head to the point that it actually had changed shape.
Looking at the body, detectives start building a theory of what happened.
She had defensive wounds on her forearms, then she was knocked down. That's when the perpetrator really went to work.
Her head was facing the small chest type freezer. There was actually two types of blood spatter on the freezer next to her head. One was like a striking motion, And one was a golf-type swing, where the spin-off from the blood spatter actually landed on that.
I can remember thinking that the perpetrator must have used 2 different weapons. The weapon was not only going through flesh and organs, going through bones, and was coming out on the floor underneath her. It was unlike anything that we'd ever seen or heard of before.
Why was this defenseless woman attacked so viciously? Detectives continue their search for evidence.
At the time, we didn't see anything stolen.
All of her large carat jewelry were on her finger and had not been touched.
The amount of damage she sustained suggests that the attacker was emotionally attached to her.
You think about someone leaving the area, dripping blood from, their arms, and not to find any blood on the door frames, handrails. It was surmisable that person had taken the time to clean up the crime scene.
But other than the evidence on the freezer and the amount of damage that she had sustained, there was no other real clues.
News of Ann's death spreads quickly in the small town.
I got the call that Ann had been murdered. And not just murdered, but unbelievably, brutally murdered. It's just something that you see on the news, but it's not real until it happens in your family.
I just felt like a ton of bricks had fallen on me. Having someone who was a second mother to me killed in such a horrible way is just overwhelmingly devastating.
Anna Mae Winstead was born in Madisonville on November 30th, 1917. And from the beginning, she stood out from the crowd.
Ann was effervescent. She just had a confidence about her, a glamour about her that was just unique.
Anna Mae was a very flamboyant lady. She had a zest for life.
In 1935, Ann married her high school sweetheart, Carol Branson.
When Anna Mae and Carol were first married, they were poor. During World War II, Anna Mae was a Rosie the Riveter, working on fighter planes.
But that was just the start for her. After that, she liked business, and she stayed in the business world.
In 1950, the hardworking couple used their savings to buy a Dairy Queen franchise.
The center of the town was the Dairy Queen, and everyone went there for date night.
Miss Ann, as a boss, was a demanding person, but she also made you feel like you were part of the family there.
They literally became multimillionaires through this Dairy Queen.
When Ann's husband, Carol, died in 1994, Ann was ready to take on a new business challenge.
She would get these older houses, and then she would make them fabulous, and then she would rent them.
Anna Mae was one of the most successful business people that I've ever known, even in her older age.
Ann was generous with her renters, and she was generous with her family. And everyone knew that they could borrow money from Ann, but they would have to pay it back.
Anna Mae was so much of a businesswoman that she kept a ledger with information about people that owed her money.
In her later years, family and business weren't the only things in Ann's life. Several months before her death, Ann had met retired eye surgeon Dr. Bob Fenneman.
Dr. Bob lived in Evansville, Indiana, about 50 miles from Madisonville. When she and Dr. Bob first started dating, she said, "Well, I've got a boyfriend." The very last thing that Anna Mae acted like was an old lady. When I found out that she was murdered, that just totally shocked me.
At the crime scene, detectives examined the rest of the house for clues.
There were no signs of forced entry into her residence.
Nothing was ransacked, like somebody was searching for something. We didn't have any idea who had committed such a violent act on an 85-year-old woman.
What kind of animal is this person?
While forensics continue their work, detectives speak to the 2 men who alerted police, her fiancé Bob and her brother Earl.
Earl was asked to establish a timeline for that Sunday, and he had provided an alibi where he was with family at the time of the murder, and the family did substantiate his whereabouts.
What about Ann's fiance? Could he have had a reason to harm her?
In a homicide of this magnitude, you need to ask who's in a relationship with this victim. When we interviewed Dr. Bob Fenneman, he was emotionally distraught.
Dr. Bob did ask Ann to marry him. She did accept his 3-carat diamond ring, but she had not set a date. They had talked about whether they would have some sort of agreement because she did have a lot of money, but she was kind of hesitant.
Police want to know, had Ann's hesitancy about Bob caused him to turn against her in a violent rage?
This person was so enraged that they just kept stabbing and kept stabbing and kept stabbing to inflict that many injuries. This was a personal crime.
Coming up, buried secrets are brought to light.
We all thought he was a family man, thought he was a churchgoer.
She explained that her alibi had been coerced.
While detectives unearth suspects with violent pasts.
He had several assaults in his past.
We're starting to think, hey, this could be our guy.
They had already stabbed another woman. We would never have dreamed who the killer was.
Detectives are investigating the horrific murder of elderly millionaire Ann Branson. Forensics suggests it was a crime of passion.
Dr. Bob, even with his age, we did feel could be a viable suspect.
Dr. Bob was from Evansville, and he drove all the time to Madisonville to court Ann. But she had not yet decided whether she was going to get married.
Had Ann's reluctance turned Bob against her?
Dr. Bob Fenneman was asked to establish a timeline and provide us with an alibi.
The day before Miss Branson was murdered, she had gone to Evansville, Indiana, to meet up with Dr. Fenneman to go to a dance. And after the dance, Miss Branson returned to Madisonville.
Sunday, he said he attempted to call her and she didn't answer the phone.
It was shortly before 10 o'clock that evening, and Dr. Fenneman said that he presumed that she had gone out or that she had gone to bed early.
So the next day, he said he became worried, and he said that's when they discovered the body at the bottom of the staircase.
Detectives learned from speaking to her family that Ann had been to an evening church service on Sunday.
Miss Branson's estimated time of death was on that Sunday evening after she returned home from church. Dr. Bob said that he was at home in Evansville, Indiana.
Taking no chances, investigators search his phone records.
Phone calls placed Dr. Bob in Evansville, Indiana, so he would not have been in the area during the time frame of the murder. He did not have the opportunity to murder her. It just wasn't feasible for him to have committed the crime.
After clearing Bob as a suspect, they ask if he can think of anyone who would harm his fiancée.
Dr. Bob recalled that her handyman, Wayne Shelton, had borrowed money from Miss Ann in the past, and the amount was more than what a handyman should be borrowing from his employer. Mr. Shelton also owed child support. He was trying to provide the court system a statement that she would guarantee his employment, and Miss Branson did not feel that she could guarantee him employment. So she had concerns over it.
The fact that the maintenance man had a financial relationship with the victim made him a person of interest that we wanted to talk to.
Detectives contact Wayne Shelton and ask him to meet them at Ann's house.
Wayne Shelton came to the crime scene when we were there, and I explained to him the circumstances of what had occurred. He was extremely shaken. He was in disbelief.
Police cut to the chase and ask Wayne where he was on the night Ann was murdered.
His alibi was he was in another county visiting with his daughter during the murder of Ann Branson.
Knowing Wayne's alibi is weak, detectives take him to the station for a polygraph. But there's just one problem.
Wayne Shelton had a heart condition. It was so fragile that it kept him from even being able to take a polygraph.
So the polygraph examiner refused to give Mr. Shelton a polygraph.
Frustrated by this setback, Ann's nephew, Jack Branson, a retired FBI officer, pulls some strings.
Mary and I hired a retired FBI polygrapher, and Wayne Shelton said, yes, I'll be polygraphed.
Jack's polygrapher takes Wayne Shelton carefully through the test questions.
Wayne Shelton passed the polygraph with flying colors. So at that point, we were able to say, okay, he passed the polygraph. He did not do it.
As investigators search for new suspects, news of the savage murder puts the whole town on edge.
This had been a little town where literally people didn't lock their doors. And all of a sudden, everyone was a suspect and everyone was afraid.
The community needed to know if they had something to fear. So it was pressure all the way around to get this crime solved.
As word spreads, police begin to receive tips from the public.
We received a tip that there was a black pickup truck at the residence after 12 at night.
Could the black truck belong to the killer? Investigators ask Ann's family if they know anyone who drives such a vehicle.
We kept hearing about a crazy tenant that drove a black truck.
What detectives learn about Ann's tenant concerns them.
Robert Prince had characteristics of a mentally unstable person.
He would actually call her in the middle of the night and say that he had ghosts up in his attic, and would she please get rid of the ghosts?
Ann always said she was nervous around him, and she didn't like it when he came to the house, and he called her at all hours of the day and night.
Miss Branson had received several complaints from the neighbors asking that she evict Mr. Prince from his apartment, and she didn't want to move him from that location.
The family would say, don't become so involved with him.
Had Ann's attempt to move Robert prompted him to attack her?
If Robert Prince was mentally unstable and became angry at her, could he have caused her death?
Detectives investigating the slaughter of Ann Branson have discovered she had been involved in a dispute with a volatile tenant.
Robert Prince would call Mrs. Branson at all hours, saying crazy things to her, wanting her to come over. They had warned her not to go over there by herself.
Due to his mental instability, he did pose a great concern for us to investigate.
Searching their database, detectives find alarming information about their new suspect.
Robert Prince was found to have had a violent criminal history. He had several assaults in his past, and he could express a lot of anger towards someone else.
Police obtain a warrant to search his home.
What we were looking for is the murder weapon. I'm looking for something that's got an edge on it, but that can snap bones and go completely through the victim's body. And I'm looking for any clothes. There's no way that the perpetrator did this without getting some of the blood on himself. But we weren't able to locate any of the items that would be of interest to us in this case.
Despite the lack of physical evidence, detectives bring Robert Prince into the station for questioning.
When he was taken from his residence and interrogated, he did not want to answer any questions to do with his prior criminal history. And upon initial confrontation with Robert Prince, he was extremely agitated.
As he starts talking, we're picking up on his violent tendencies. We're starting to think, hey, you know, this could be our guy.
Detectives note that Robert's right arm is injured.
Even though he's a man that could inflict this kind of punishment, he can't bend his right arm. And we asked him, so you right-handed or left-handed? He said, I'm right-handed.
Detectives wonder, could Robert have hurt his arm attacking Ann?
He said he was in another state at the estimated time of death for Miss Branson.
Robert Prince gave the alibi that he was with some family in Tennessee and that he had stopped in a convenience store and got some gas and got a soda or something.
With nothing concrete linking Robert to the homicide, police have to let him go, and detectives get to work checking his alibi.
We contact that convenience store, pull surveillance video, and lo and behold, there's Robert Prince on camera.
And in addition to that, prior to Miss Branson's murder, Robert Prince had surgery to his elbow area and his arm, and according to his doctor, if he had inflicted those injuries upon Miss Branson, then all of his staples and his stitches in his arm would no longer be intact. So the alibi and surgical area just ruled him out as a suspect.
Back at square one, detectives are relying on the autopsy to break open new leads.
The autopsy revealed that Mrs. Branson was stabbed about 97 times throughout her body. Her skull was pulverized. She was beaten so badly that a lot of the stab wounds were actually inflicted after she had passed away.
The evidence technician said that we're not talking about just a regular old steak knife. That's something that's very heavy because the blade is going through her bones, through her organs, and was coming out on the other side.
While the autopsy fails to identify an actual murder weapon, it gives a clear estimate of Ann's time of death.
There was a pot on the stove, which she had baked her supper. She had eaten. We were able to analyze the food in her stomach. And based on the absorption rate principle, the time of death for her was approximately 30 minutes after she got home from church.
It was determined that her time of death was between 7 and 7:30 p.m.
As police continue their search for the killer, Ann's family struggles with her death.
Mary and I walked over to Earl's house to see how he was dealing with the grief. And his son, Russell, took us in to see Earl.
The whole family was in shock, and everyone was just questioning who could have possibly done this.
Earl and Russell, they were both saying, we'll be glad when we found out who did this. And we understood that was exactly how we were feeling.
As the family grieves, Madisonville residents question whether their town really is the best town on earth.
When the town found out that Miss Branson had been murdered, it scared a lot of people because you would think there's just a serial killer or somebody crazy running around to have done that.
This is Madisonville, Kentucky, coined best town on earth. You cannot have an unsolved murder of one of its most prominent members. It can't happen.
As detectives contemplate their next move, an unexpected tip sends the case in a new direction.
We're day 4 or 5 into this investigation, but we have nothing strong yet. And then we get a phone call.
That was the pivotal turning point.
The caller is a local mine worker named Jeff Hibbs.
Jeff Hibbs has some information about one of Anna Mae's nephews, Russell Winstead.
That phone call basically shocked and rocked our investigation.
Five days after the bloody murder of 85-year-old Ann Branson, police are contacted by a man named Jeff Hibbs, who makes a stunning allegation.
Jeff Hibbs believe that Russell Winstead had some involvement with the murder of his aunt, Anna Mae Branson.
Russell Winstead was known as a coal miner, a hard worker. He had 3 sons. He was married to Terry Winstead. It was known that he and his family attended church regularly.
Jeff claims that Russell has a secret unknown to his family.
Jeff Hibbs told us that Russell Winstead had an extreme gambling addiction.
He also tells detectives that he'd gone gambling with Russell a few nights before Ann's murder.
Russell told Jeff he had gotten a loan from his aunt that he had to repay by Monday morning, and that he had $9,700, and he lost every single penny of that money.
Russell told Jeff that they're all going to know about his gambling addiction because his aunt is going to expose him for borrowing money from her on a regular basis and not paying it back.
Jeff tells police that on Monday, the local headlines grabbed his attention.
Jeff Hibbs reads about this old lady that got murdered in Madisonville.
And he was like, oh my gosh, this is the aunt that Russell had to repay by the first of the week.
Detectives go back to Ann's house to search for evidence.
On our second search, I found a ledger and the large amount of loans that was written down for one nephew. They totaled up almost $100,000. The day before her murder, she had actually written down that he had received $9,700 from her and that he had paid her a check for $12,000.
Detectives believe that Russell had given Ann a check in hopes of winning enough at the casino to cover it. But when the check is nowhere to be found, detectives subpoena his bank records.
Upon the financial investigation, it was determined that Russell was basically shifting money around to cover the loans from his aunt. And the missing check for the $12,000 never cleared the bank.
10 days after the homicide, detectives interview Russell Winstead.
Even when we told him that Miss Branson had put it in her ledger, Russell still denied any knowledge of that check. He denied having any involvement in this whatsoever. At the time of death, Russell explained that he had gone to church and that upon leaving church, he had dropped his children off at his ex-wife's house, and then that he was at home in the basement.
Russell said he got home about 7:25 p.m.
With Ann's time of death estimated between 7 and 7:30 p.m., detectives interview Russell's wife, Terry, to verify his alibi.
Terry's explanation for Russell was down to the minute.
She said, yeah, we went to church. We drove separate. He dropped his son off at his ex-wife's house, and then he got home 7:25.
Russell had a solid alibi. His wife told the exact same story he did as to where Russell was on the night of Mrs. Branson's death.
There's just one loose end for detectives to tie up: Russell's casino visits.
I asked, you know Russell gambles, right? She's like, yeah, I know he gambles. I was like, on a bad night, what do you think he loses? And she's like, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000. I was like, try 38,000 on one night. And then she started bawling.
This was just devastating to her because she trusted Russell.
That same day, police get a search warrant for Russell's home.
We didn't find the murder weapon. We didn't find any clothes that were bloodstained. But we did recover a couple of burner cell phones that his wife didn't know even existed.
One of the cell phones was only used to contact a waitress at one of the casinos.
Russell had a girlfriend who worked at the casino.
So we talked to the waitress, and it alarmed us somewhat that even after he's a suspect of interest in a murder case, Russell was still continuing to go to the casino, still trying to be the high roller.
Russell has plenty of secrets. But do money problems and infidelity make him a killer?
Russell's father, Earl, told me the police are trying to jam Russell up because they need a suspect and they want to solve this case.
When we found out that Russell had been living a literal double life, we were shocked. But we felt that there was no way Russell had not done this. We believed it with all of our hearts.
But as they dig deeper into Russell's gambling, detectives find evidence of a man out of control.
We come with a total of 236 times that Russell had visited a casino in the last year, losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in that time frame.
When it's rolled up into one, you're just like going, who is this guy?
The scope of Russell's betrayal prompts his wife, Terry, to kick him out of the house and return to police with a damning admission.
Terry explained that her alibi had been coerced.
She said that Russell is the one that told her what to say.
She explained that Russell actually did not come home around 7:30 p.m., that it was more like 9. So that put him as being a person that could have committed this murder.
Investigators obtain a warrant for Russell's arrest, but when they go to bring him in, they're in for a shock.
Russell Winstead had fled the country. We were very concerned that he would not be brought to justice.
When I found out that Russell Winstead had fled, it was my goal to get him, no matter what the cost, manpower, what it took.
The prime suspect in the murder of Ann Branson is her nephew, Russell Winstead. But before investigators can make an arrest, Russell goes on the run.
For Russell to have fled the country, it was shocking to all of us.
An innocent man doesn't flee like that. This is the last straw, and he has to come back.
I have never been a person that takes waiting very well, and our son came up with the idea of putting this case on America's Most Wanted.
If you've seen Russell Winstead, please call our hotline tonight, 1-800-CRIME-TV.
They aired the show February of '05, and then in May of '05, Russell was spotted at a casino in Costa Rica.
He was living under a pseudonym. He was still bouncing from female to female, and he was living the lifestyle that he attempted to live here.
We knew where he was. We wanted justice.
There's just one problem. With Russell facing a potential death sentence at home, Costa Rican authorities refuse to hand him over.
Costa Rica will not extradite anyone to the United States where the death sentence is a possibility. And also, they have gambling. So Russell had done his homework big time.
While investigators strategize how to get Russell back to Kentucky, they make a troubling discovery.
We found out that Russell's father, Earl, had been providing Russell with monies for his lifestyle in Costa Rica.
We had a guy come forward that said that Earl was actually paying him to wire money via Western Union to Russell in Costa Rica. We believed Earl was actually aiding and abetting Russell's flight.
With Earl sending his son proceeds from the estate of the person he murdered, it basically rubbed salt in the wound. It turned your stomach.
Investigators set up a sting to catch Earl red-handed.
So we wired this guy up as a confidential informant, and he met Earl, wired the money, and we got Earl doing that 2 or 3 times.
It was verified that Earl was sending money to Russell in Costa Rica.
While investigators find no evidence that Earl was involved in his sister Ann's murder, they arrest him for helping his son evade justice.
It really struck all of us by surprise. The thought that Russell Winstead's father, Earl Winstead, was sending money down to live on in Costa Rica just sat like a burr under a saddle with me.
I remember Earl being led out in handcuffs because he was arrested for helping a fugitive. But what really hurt us deeply was the fact that we knew it was Ann's money that was paying for her murderer.
Earl eventually pleads guilty to 7 counts of hindering apprehension.
He was placed on probation for 2 years, and if he contacted Russell at any point during those 2 years, then he would have to serve jail time.
While Earl faces legal trouble at home, federal authorities move in on Russell in Costa Rica.
Russell was observed at the gambling casinos. They felt that that was probably the safest place for them to take him into custody. So as Russell was leaving the gambling casino in Costa Rica, he was apprehended.
He was arrested in May of 2005 in Costa Rica. We did not get him back to Kentucky until February of the following year. Extraditing someone back from another country takes a lot of time, and federal authorities had to make assurances that we would not seek the death penalty against Russell.
It took us 7 months to extradite him back to the United States.
To know that it was taking this long was very hard. In fact, every time we'd visit a cemetery where Amma's buried, I'd say, we're gonna get him. We're gonna get him. That was a long, slow process.
Finally, more than 3 years after Ann's murder, Russell Winstead is returned home to face trial for the murder of his aunt.
That day, I'll never forget. I went back to Amma's grave and said, we got him. And I felt like a burden had been lifted because we knew what justice was going to be done.
Upon Russell's return to Kentucky, we were preparing for a trial when we got another humongous bombshell as far as our investigation is concerned.
Someone who was also charged with murder of an elderly lady came forward saying that he was the one who had killed Mrs. Branson.
All of this evidence has been stacking up against Russell Winstead. And here comes some guy out of the blue telling us that he's the one who committed the murder.
The confession is contained in a letter posted from Hopkins County Jail by an accused murderer named Fred Roulette.
Fred Roulette basically gives detailed information on the murder of Ann Branson that was never publicly made known. He stated that the murder weapon was a Bradis hammer. It is a mining tool, and he advised that he had modified that.
Fred Roulette provided a drawing of Mrs. Branson's home, and it was eerily accurate.
He gives all of these details that only the killer would know. I was like, how could we have gotten this wrong?
Police have arrested Russell Winstead for the brutal murder of his aunt, Ann Branson. But now accused murderer Fred Roulette has confessed to the crime, leaving investigators reeling.
Fred Roulette was also charged with murdering an elderly lady. So you think, oh my gosh, did we get it wrong?
It was completely devastating. So we were determined we were going to find out the circumstances of his confession.
Investigators throw all their resources into checking the validity of Fred's confession.
Fred was a drug addict, and he could not provide the details of the murder and robbery that he himself had committed to the level of detail that he provided about Mrs. Branson's case.
When investigators check the jail records, they discover a telling detail.
Fred did not come forward until after Russell had been extradited back to Kentucky, and Fred Roulette and Russell Winstead were cellmates.
Already facing 25 years on a separate murder charge, Fred Roulette insists to detectives that he killed Ann Branson.
Fred didn't realize until we told him that if he wanted to confess to this murder, it now packed a death penalty. After Fred heard those words, he was like, oh, no, game's off, gig's up.
That's when he told investigators that he had all the intimate details of the murder from Russell Winstead. Fred Roulette was promised that his family would receive compensation. Since he was going to be in prison for the additional murder, so Fred Roulette agreed to take the false confession.
With Russell's deception exposed, his trial can proceed. In July 2007, 4 years after Ann's murder, a jury hears what really happened on that Sunday night in January 2003.
Mrs. Branson had loaned Russell upwards of $100,000. And Mrs. Branson notated in that ledger was that she had received that $12,000 check from Russell on Saturday. As partial repayment of the loan, Russell had a large sum of money that he lost in the casino, and he made mention that he needed to pay back to his aunt on Monday. Russell knew he could not make good on that $12,000 check.
I believe that Russell Winstead was so desperate that he went over and he attempted to talk Miss Ann into tearing up the $12,000 check. When that didn't work, I believe that he lost it and that he snapped.
And that's when she started receiving all the damage to the 65 plus stab wounds to her back. We still do not know to this day how many times Ann Mae Branson was hit in the head.
He cleaned up the crime scene, and he felt that he could get away with murder.
Person that ended up being the killer.
When they announced the verdict, relief washed over me like Niagara Falls, a relief that this jury saw through Russell Winstead, and he did not fool them.
Finally, Miss Ann got her justice, and everybody who loved and knew her got a form of justice.
I miss Ann every day. And finally, I can think of her without thinking of her murder. I can finally think of her for who she was. Beautiful, beautiful part of our family.
Ann Mae took pride in who she was. I think she'd be happy to be remembered as someone who enjoyed life and had a good one.